right, well, as you said, my name is Daniel. I'm from Texas. What part of Texas are you from?
Dallas.
Dallas. Okay, I'm from Austin, so Dallas, okay. Cool. Yes, yes, another Texas person. It's funny. Like Chris said, I've pioneered some DPS schools at different locations. The first place that I went to pioneer was South Africa, on the Muizenberg base. And what they have a pretty big building that they kind of rent out on Thursdays for like their main service, like their you guys have like morning service on like Tuesdays, is that right? And I did my DTS in Kona, Kona, we have Thursday night, everybody gets together in the Ohana Court for Thursday night. And one of the things they do in South Africa is if you're visiting and you raise your hand and they come by and they ask you, what country are you from? And anytime people ask me when I'm international, they ask me what country I'm from, I never say America. I always say Texas, because that's Texas, all right? I am very excited to be here. It's always really weird to me. I've been traveling and teaching in YWAM since 2018. And I've been doing mainly teaching since I think the last time I led a school was mid 2020. So I've been doing mostly teaching, but it's still awkward for me to be introduced by somebody because somebody's up there talking about you, they're like, oh, he's so great, he's so wonderful, and you're like, especially if somebody is introducing me that I'm friends with. I have a friend named Andrew York who introduces me, and we're really close, and he'll talk about like, oh, he's such great, and I'm sitting there going, like, what do you do when someone's talking about you being amazing? Like, do you nod? Like, yeah, I really am. So that's good like that. I mean, I really am that great. Or it's kind of like, when it's your birthday and they sing happy birthday, it's like, what do you do? Like, do you clap? Do you sing? So I end up just sitting there staring at the floor. Anyways. I'm very excited to be here. I'm also very nervous about this week. I have taught, counted it up the other day. I've taught over 30 times in DBS. I have like an ongoing list in my phone where I started to put in there, and the other day I counted up, I've taught week 1 14 times now, which is pretty amazing. Like, I didn't realize that I'd taught week 1 that many times. And I've taught all but 2 weeks of the school, this being one of the weeks that I haven't taught. And when I was a student, this guy, Dan Lewis, who is a Bible scholar, a legit genius level intellect guy, like whenever he taught, we asked him, in so many words, we asked him, can you dumb your language down? Because he was a university professor for 40 years. And so he was like, oh yeah, like we had to ask him like 3 times to dumb his language down. And so he taught King's Week. So in my mind, King's Week was this level that I just never thought that I could get to. And it took a long time for me to kind of like take off the pressure of this week, because I've heard other people do it, and I've heard other people who aren't Bible scholars teach this week and do a really good job. I'm like, oh, it's not that, oh God, I can do this. And like whenever I say Bible scholar, I used to think Bible scholar is just somebody who read the Bible a lot or like really likes the Bible. Like, and I didn't know this, there is actually a biblical scholar like society that you have to do some kind of scholarly work and submit it and have it peer reviewed and accepted, and then like you are a Bible scholar. And like, I had no idea. And like Dan Lewis is like a legit Bible scholar. And I have a whole lot of his slides in my slides. And so if there comes a slide that seems like if you're reading it and like the language is really smart, it's not. Lots of times he'll have a word on the slide and I'm like, what does that mean? And I'll have to pull out my dictionary and look at, oh, okay. Anyways, I say I'm very excited about this week because I am. I'm excited to teach. I love teaching, but I'm also really nervous about teaching this week because it's this week that I've kind of built up in my head. And one of the things that I really hope I can do for you guys is really get you down to the heart of what's going on. You guys have gone through a big portion of the scripture so far, and you guys have read the whole Torah, right? The first 5 books of the Bible, and you've gone through a whole lot of biblical history. And now you guys have just kind of scratched the surface of the parts of the Bible that I call like the bummer portions of the Bible, because it's about to be a really big bummer. Have y'all read any of the Kings yet? What have y'all read?
No, not in the class. Not yet.
As
Okay.
a group, we're starting this out.
Okay, so you have not read First Kings yet.
First, second, Samuel.
Drop in, because it is about to get really sad really fast. It starts off, I mean, you've had a little bit of sad in Samuel, because like you see David and you're like, yeah, David, and you're like, oh, David, no, David, no, come on. And then Solomon's gonna take over, you're like, yeah, Solomon, you're like, no, Solomon, no. And then it's just downhill a lot, and it just keeps going down. In fact, I venture to say it's downhill until Jesus. You're in part now, and there are little moments of bright spots, like you get in there and you have Isaiah, but first half of Isaiah is kind of a bummer. But then you have these, and I remember as a student reading in small group, and like I grew up in the church. I got saved when I was 7. I got baptized when I was 7, but it didn't really become real to me until I was 13. In fact, I think when I said the prayer of salvation when I quoted The Princess Bride when I said my prayer. It's my favorite movie of all time. And I quoted it, but it didn't become real to me until I was 13. And I felt the Lord call me, or I felt the pull into full-time ministry when I was that age, and I knew that's what I wanted to do from when I was 13. I've been involved in church and doing ministry stuff since then. I went to a 2-year Bible school in Texas called Texas Bible Institute, and I jumped into ministry like right after. I did like 1.5 years of youth ministry before Bible school. And then I jumped into youth ministry at my church, where it was me and this other married couple, this like 3-headed, I want to say monster because we're like nice people, but like this 3-headed leadership. Yeah, beast. That's what that. Yeah, okay. That's good. And I led worship in the youth group, so I play the guitar and say this is internationally accepted for the motion for playing the guitar. This is emailing. So if you guys are if you're like struggling with language barrier and you want to say email, you can say this. Like I was emailing, like, oh yeah. Anyways, 13.5 years of youth ministry at my church, doing lots of leadership classes and a whole bunch of like Timothy fellowship stuff where they're preparing people for stuff. And I'd never read the whole Bible. In fact, I never read the whole Bible until I was in DVS. I've never read the book of Revelation because it was scary. It's not scary. The Revelation is actually great. I mean, it's only scary if you're not saved. But it's a great book. And I've never read Song of Songs because it's the dating book. And I was like, I'm going to save that one until don't do that, read the Bible. But I hadn't read it all the way through until my DBS. And I'd been in ministry for 15 years up until I'd come to YWAM. I remember when my school leader at the end, when we finished reading Revelation, and she said, she got up in front of the class. We read it together like as a class. And she got up and said, congratulations, you've read through the whole Bible. And everybody was like, yeah. And I was like, yeah. My first thought was, why did it take me so long? Because I was 34 whenever I joined YWAM. And here I was, having been in ministry for 15 years, and I'd never read the Bible all the way through. And I heard a story, and it really stuck with me. As a student, this guy, he's the SBS leader in the Sunny Coast in Australia, his name is Brian. He told a story of this I don't know if it was him or if he was telling us a story, but they do ministry and stuff in China. And you guys have ever been to a country that doesn't have a Christian history? Like my outreach to China, like sometimes like if you did outreach and stuff, or you're a Christian in America, most people you're going to encounter in America have some kind of Christian upbringing, whether they were brought up or they know. And so when you are like evangelizing, you're usually coming up against some church understanding that you may have to help to correct or whatever. China, nothing, right? I mean, it's not a Christian nation. And so like, going to people in China and talking to them about God, they have no idea. And so you have like, you are the one laying the foundation. Because I remember one of the people that we had met, one of our friends, we watched this movie, and like I was talking about how, when Jesus was being crucified, it was so difficult. And she's like, well, why? I was like, because it's Jesus. And she's like, who's Jesus? And I went, how do you describe Jesus to somebody who has nothing? Like nothing to springboard from. Because if I were to ask that question before I told you this story, who is Jesus? You guys, I mean, all of us would have different responses, but it would usually be, something from, oh, he's my best friend. But who is he? Right? Like, I get that you know him and that you love him, but who is he? And it was an interesting moment for me where I had to like really think of how I was going to describe Jesus to somebody who didn't know Jesus. Anyway, this guy, this Chinese guy, came to, I don't know how it happened, but the guy, he gave him a Bible. And he said, I'm going to read your Bible and decide if I want to follow this God. And he was like, great. So the guy came back, I don't know how much longer, he came back and said, I've read the Bible and I've decided that I want to follow your God. Which is awesome, right? I mean, that's great. Somebody reads the Bible and they make the decision they want to follow the Lord. Like, that is fantastic. But it was a Bible that in it had this read the Bible through in a year. You know what I'm talking about? You ever seen Bibles that have to read the Bible through in a year plan and everything? Well, just genuine curiosity. The guy was like, you have this plan to read through the Bible in a year. So do people do that? And Brian was like, oh, some people do that. Some people use it as a guy. And this is also going to happen a lot. I tear up and cry a lot. And I'm not a good cry talker. Like some people who like are going to cry and they can still talk and you can still understand what they're saying. It doesn't sound awful. I cannot. And so I have to wait until it passes. And even so, like sometimes I feel like, oh, I've been waiting for too long and I need to start talking. And yeah, it's just bad. Anyways, that'll happen a lot. Be prepared for that. He said, do people do that? And Brian was like, oh, well, some people do, some people use it. And he asked a question that really stuck with me. The guy asked him a question, he said, why would it take you so long? He said, as a Christian, you say this holds everything that you believe. Why would it take you a year to read it? I was so convicted. Because I'd been in ministry and I hadn't read the whole Bible. I'd read the Old Testament a few times. I'm sure, like a lot of us in here, we've read Genesis and Exodus a couple of times because you have your New Year's resolution at the beginning of January. You're like, I'm gonna read the Bible this year, right? You read Genesis, you're like, yeah. And you get the first half of Exodus, you're like, yeah. And you get to Exodus chapter 20 and you're like, oh no. And you keep going in Exodus, you're like, what have I done? Then you get to Leviticus and you're like, I can't do it. I call Leviticus the Christian graveyard because that's where most people stop. It was just this conviction that I felt of how do I view the Bible? And if we say that this is the thing that we believe, we need to know why we believe it. We need to know what's in it. And this way you guys are in a tremendously amazing position. Because you are reading the Bible. But you're not only reading the Bible, you're reading it in context, and you're learning how it's connected, and you're learning that it's a story. One of the things, I don't know if you guys ever heard this, the Bible as an acrostic, like basic instructions before leaving Earth. Everybody heard that? It's cute, right? But basic instructions before leaving Earth, Bible. It's cute, right? You're like, oh, but if we view the Bible as an instruction book, how do you guys, when you get something new that has an instruction book, you read it? Yeah. I mean, yeah, if it's medication, sure, yeah, you read medication, or if it's like, how many of you guys, if you have like, how many of you guys have an iPhone? How many of you guys read the instruction book for the iPhone? No, it's usually YouTube, like how to, and then like you go, like usually instruction manuals end up in that one drawer in the kitchen, the drawer I'm talking about that has like the twist ties from the bread, and like loose sauce packets, like you get ketchup in there and Taco Bell, hey, that's like if you don't know what to do with it, it goes in that drawer. And that's usually what we do with instruction manuals, and it's like, there's usually one nerd somewhere in classes, people are like, oh, you read instruction books, like, you're the odd one out. Like, nobody reads it, and if we view the Bible as an instruction book, we kind of approach it with that attitude. If we think that I'm only going to get answers from what I want and need in here, we're going to miss it. And especially if we approach the Bible as this is a requirement of a Christian to read this, then all of a sudden we view the Bible as a chore and something that we just need to get done. And one of the things that I love about the DBS is that you guys learn to read the Bible with the intent to discover. You are looking for God's character and nature. You are looking for God's redemptive plan. Instead of going, read 5 chapters a day. You remember when that was a lot? Do you guys remember when reading 5 chapters a day was a lot? I do. It was like, they were like, oh, 5 chapters. Then in, DBS, you get there and it's like 33 chapters in Jeremiah, and one day you're like, oh my. As a staff, reading through that when I was staffing for my second time, I was like, I had in my mind like what chapter we need to get to before taking a break. And as I'm ready to look at my small group, I'm like, no, we're not gonna make it. There's just something, I mean, you do a lot of reading in DBS, but one of the things that it taught me was I was looking for things. And all of a sudden it became exciting whenever I found a character and nature of God. Or I found a biblical action principle. Or I found like we're reading, and it would be one of those things like, was that Jesus? Did you guys, was that Jesus? Well, hold on, I'll read it again. Is that, I underline that. Did you guys like that? Like when we first got to the New Testament, we read 1 Peter, and like I think I underlined the whole book. When we got there, it was like you're reading, and like the person reading would read. I should actually read out of 1 Peter, so I'm giving this example. It's like people are reading and it would be like this. You'd go, therefore, preparing your minds for action and being sober-minded, set your hope fully on, and they slow down because they're underlining as they read. Yeah. Or you read like a few, and it's like you stop because everybody was looking for stuff, because all of a sudden you were recognizing stuff in the Bible, and it becomes exciting. And that's something that I love about the DBS is it changes your perspective on the text. Because especially, I came in, I grew up in the church, and we've always had the importance of the Bible preached to us. And I had even done that as a youth minister. Like I preached, I held up my Bible, and I get very worked up. And I'd be like, this is and I wasn't reading it. You guys are doing something that's incredibly important. The majority of people who go to church don't read this on their own. and they either haven't read it in its entirety, or they only, or they have, but they rely on the pastor to give them insight instead of themselves. You guys are doing something that's amazing, and you also are going to have an incredible responsibility once you graduate. Because people are gonna know that you're going to have this. People are gonna be looking at you for some kind of thought or response or answer, okay? And it's just something you just have to get used to, right? As a Christian, you're an ambassador for Christ. If people know that you're a Christian and you be appeared somewhere, they're gonna be like, oh, Christians. Or just like, if they know that you're a YWAMer and you go to a cafe and you're a turn in a cafe, they're like, oh, those YWAMers. Because you represent YWAM wherever you go, whether you like it or not, that's just part of the deal. And I've had it happen, where I've been in Bible studies and people are gonna talk about something, they're like, oh, correct me if I'm wrong, Daniel, the Bible guy in here. I'm like, you stop doing that, man. Like, I'm here to enjoy the Bible stuff. Like, you just do your thing. Anyways, this is a rabbit trail that I'm just chasing. Are you guys okay?
Yep.
I will say this, before I actually start clicking through slides. I love questions. I am a Bible nerd, so I love talking about the Bible. I love having discussions about the Bible. No question is going to be like, you guys have heard the phrase, there's no stupid questions, just stupid people. Are we recording this now? What I like to say is there is no dumb, the only dumb question is the one that you don't ask. Okay, so please ask questions. You let me decide if the question is something that we should discuss in class or talk about outside of class. Okay, I've had questions as difficult as, what's the difference between water baptism and baptism in the Holy Spirit and fire and tongues and stuff like that. And I've had easy questions like, what's a she goat? It's a girl goat. So feel free to ask questions. And outside of class, you're not going to annoy me with questions, okay? Talking about the Bible brings me joy. Talking about the DBS brings me joy. I helped write your manual and I helped do a whole bunch of the homework. If you have questions about homework, I'm like the homework guy. All right, so you're not going to, like, if you see me sitting at a meal, don't be like, I don't want to bother. And it's like, you also have to pee while you want to ask me a question. You're like, oh, I don't want to bother him. Like, you're not going to bother me because I'm passionate about it. Okay. 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 Thank you. 15 years youth ministry. You need to talk back to me. Not back to me. But respond. Okay.
Okay.
No, test time. The Texan passed. All right, right here. Okay. King's Week, am I right? I have pictures of my family because, like any guest speaker, any real guest speaker, I have pictures because I am a real guest speaker. This is my mom. Her name is Kathy. For the longest time, I would just say this is my mom and not introduce her because to me, that is introducing her because she's mom to me, but you guys don't know her. Well, you can call her mom, she's fine with that. But anyways, her name is Kathy. She's wonderful. She is the best mother that I could ask for. She is my biggest supporter, my biggest cheerleader, prays for me constantly. She's amazing. And that is my sister's oldest son, Donnie. And to answer your question that I know you're thinking, yes, he is the cutest. I know that you're thinking, oh, isn't he just the cutest? Yeah, yes, he is the cutest. This is my brother. His name is Luke. And that's his wife, Juna. You can tell that she is not white. She is Japanese. My brother was in the Marines and he was stationed in Japan. That's where they met. That's not one of his children. That is my sister's other son. His name is Archer, and he is the cutest. He's not that age anymore. They grow so fast. I gave up putting in current pictures because every time you turn around, they're bigger. I do have a more current one than that, but like, it's like every 10 days they look different. Especially back then. This is my brother's oldest boy. His name is Jacob. This is when he graduated high school. He is now like in his second year in college. Some of you guys can't relate to this, some of you can. It's super weird to see somebody that you held as a baby be 20. It's like, how are you in college? It's just super weird, but that's an experience that I'm going through with my nephews. That's my brother's youngest son. His name's Marcus. That is my mom's dog. His name is Henry. He's also older than this in this picture, but he's still really tiny. He's a Boston Terrier, and he's the cutest. Any questions? This is my sister. Her name is Jillian, and that is her husband, Don. And if you can't tell from the picture and her hat, this picture was taken at Christmas time. It's an important detail.
And the real decoration.
Yeah, the decorations on the back, yeah. And this is last year in like, around this time of year. It was in October. That's Donnie and Archer, and they're the best. Love them. And I have this picture in here. This is my grandmother. She died December 24th, 2020. Her name was Gloria. And she was 99 years old.
Wow.
Yeah, I'll say that again. She was 99 years old. And she still had her mind, like she could still lecture you about stuff that you did when you were like a kid. She was the stereotypical blue hair Baptist lady. If you guys, some of you don't know what I'm talking about, some of you do, but it's okay. She is a big reason why I am who I am. I memorized my first Bible verse at her table when I was a kid. I have a brother and I have two cousins. We're all around the same age, and we would spend weeks at grandma's house during the summer. She lived like right above a baseball field and like not far from the neighborhood pool. And so I basically grew up in a neighborhood pool. We'd go swim and get like the stamp so you could come back in, go home and eat, then come back and swim some more. She got into missions late in life. She went on her first missions trip, I want to say to Africa. It was Africa or Russia or somewhere like that, but she was 75. Yeah, is when she did her first missions trip. And then when she was like 80, she went to, so she did all of her missions traveling when she was like in her mid 70s to the 80s.
Wow.
And she went to Israel, she went to Africa, she went to Russia, she went to all of these like crazy missionary locations as an old lady. And I didn't think that, like right now, like, I don't know how old you are, I'm not gonna guess. But if I said you were a certain age and I got it wrong and I made you older than you actually are, people usually get a little upset at that. They're like, oh, hey, I'm 20, whatever. I thought that went away the older you get. Well, I aged my grandma 1 year and she was not happy with me. Like at Christmas or something, we were complaining, I was complaining like about being in my 30s. I was like, oh, yeah, 30. And my aunt was like, well, just wait until you're 50 or wait until you're 60. And my grandma was like, well, wait until like she came in, like, and I was like, well, you know, when you're 96. She was like, hey, I'm 93. And I was like, oh, so sorry. It matters. Anyways, grandma, this is my favorite picture of me and my siblings. My grandma asked for a picture of all of her grandchildren, and this is what we sent her. I love it. It's so much fun. This is iced tea in my glass, so everybody calm down. And this is an antique pipe that was my grandpa's. So, and this is all calm down. It's an antique 6-shooter gun. It doesn't work anymore. But this is I love this picture. And you can't really see it, but on the grip here, there is a coiled snake with the phrase "Don't tread on me" on it. You know, what's your name? Sandy knows what I'm talking about. There was a regiment of troops during, I think, the Revolutionary War from Texas that flew this big yellow flag with a coiled snake on it that said "Don't tread on me." That's very Texas thing. Anyways, do you have a mug that says "Don't tread on me"?
No, it says liberty over death.
Oh yeah.
But it is
Yeah.
That's awesome.
That's and I have a T-shirt that I don't think I packed it. It has a cannon on it and it says "Come and take it," which was another thing in Texas. We sent grandma this picture, and this picture actually ended up framed in her house, which is really funny. We took normal pictures for her also. It all worked out. This is a picture of my father. He passed in June 1st, 2012. I used to not have this picture in my slides, and I don't know why. It was just, I just didn't really, I don't know why. But I put him in here because he was an amazing father. I don't struggle at all with the idea of God being a father because I had a great one. It took me a long time as a youth minister to wrap my brain around the fact that when I talk about God the Father, sometimes that's upsetting to people because they don't have good dads and they don't have a good example of that. And it took me a while to understand that because my dad was a really good dad. We found out that he had cancer and he was gone 11 days later. Well, it's the first time I'd ever experienced tragedy, you know. I mean, I lost a pet. That's a bummer when you lose a pet. And I'd had my heart broken. But nothing compares to stuff like that. It was definitely a marking moment in my life, but my father definitely gave me he loved the Bible and he loved intercessory prayer. He's a great guy. That's my family. All right. This is actually me as a student. This is Thanksgiving with me as a DBS student. I didn't pose for that picture. I was just kind of sitting there at the table waiting to be called up for. There's people who did their DTS in Kona. Who did Kona stuff? I know you did. You did. Is there one more? Or just two? Just two? Or did she do it?
No,
Raising her hand. Washington. But you know, you guys have been in the cafeteria and I don't know if you guys were there during Thanksgiving, but I mean, it's really difficult to feed 700 people or whatever. So yeah. Anyways, I have a slide here to remind me to tell a bit about myself, which I've already done. When is our first break?
The biggest break, half hour, is at 11. You can have breaks in between, short breaks in between.
I just wanted to make sure. Oh, okay. Okay.
So 11 o'clock, the whole base.
11 o'clock, the whole base. Okay, so we will go until 11. Good?
Sure. No problem. You might have some people.
Just kidding. Oh my gosh. I would definitely give you guys stretch breaks and stuff like that. I'm a YWAMer. I've also led schools, and so I can recognize when people are like tired of hearing me from up here. All right. So what I want to do is kind of give you an idea of where we are going this week. We're going to be looking at Kings and Chronicles. You covered First Chronicles last week. The book that we're going to cover is Second Chronicles.
Not yet. I moved Chronicles to Prophets.
Oh.
I touched on it. I touched on it a little bit. But...
Just kidding. But we will briefly look at it because it's good to know, because there are it's a history of something of the same time. So Kings covers the history of the kings, and Chronicles also covers the history of the kings from a different viewpoint. Okay, so we're going to be looking at the difference between the King's history and the Chronicles history. What's the difference? We're going to be looking at the history of the time, what's going on during this era, because there are a lot of significant things that are happening that is good for us to understand as we move forward. Foreign powers is going to be a really significant piece for this week. In the text, the foreign powers are mentioned, but it's not given a whole lot of detail. But I will go into some detail as far as who the foreign powers are, and the significance for each one. You guys, have you guys heard about the foreign powers yet? No. When I say foreign powers, you don't know what I'm talking about?
All those bites.
Huh?
All those bites.
No, those are all the ites and the bites, those are people within the promised land. Okay, so foreign powers like Egypt is a foreign power because it's not in the land and they are like a world nation power. You guys will hear about, you read about Syria or Aram, however you want to pronounce it, the name, and then Assyria and Babylon. And then as time moves forward, you'll get into Persia and then Greece and then Rome. We won't cover Persia, Greece, or Rome because that is later on, but we will go into detail about some stuff for like the Assyrians and the Babylonians, because those guys are really important to what's going on here. Something that's really important to understand or to know about the Bible, or to underknow. That can be a word now. Something that's really good to underknow about the Bible is the text does something called telescoping. Have you guys heard of that idea before? Okay, so at Genesis chapter 12, the story shifts in the Bible, because before the first 11 chapters of Genesis, it was like, you had, all kind of things going on with kind of a scatter shot around the world, where there wasn't like a specific thing that the Bible was focusing in on until Genesis chapter 12 with Abraham, the Abrahamic covenant. This is where the Bible does something called telescoping, okay? It means that it telescopes in on Abraham and Abraham's family and everything that goes on with Abraham to the exclusion of everything else, okay? So the world is continuing to develop while the Bible is focusing in on the nation, the Hebrews, the nation of Israel. Does that make sense? Okay, so like when this foreign power comes in, you have no idea who they are, like where did they come from? It's because the Bible isn't interested in them, they're interested in the history of the nation of Israel, okay? And then sometimes prophets will do even more telescoping and they'll zoom in on certain stuff. Okay, yeah, makes sense. Okay. That's what I mean by foreign powers. Okay. We'll take a look at the kingdom divided. So far, David has united the kingdom. And like David is the gold standard for kings. Okay, like when you get into 2 Kings and it starts to focus in on the kings of Judah, which are all in the line of David, they will all be measured by one thing. It's whether or not they followed in the footsteps of their father David. Okay, so David is the gold standard for kings, but not just Judah. David is the gold standard for kings who reign. But we will talk about the divided kingdom. I have a laser pointer and I can't point at the screen. We'll talk about the kingdoms divided and what happens to cause the division. Because have you guys heard of the divided kingdom, that the nations divide? Okay, spoiler alert if you haven't heard it yet. Because so far it's been the nation of Israel, and then all of a sudden there will be a nation of Israel and a nation of Judah. And then eventually it will only be referred to as the nation of Judah, because Israel will be, and we'll get into what happens, spoiler alert, we'll get into what happens with Israel. So you can underknow all that stuff. All right. So we'll look at the journey to the fall of the nation, and then we'll take a look at how this is a continuation of God's redemptive plan. How all of this fits into the overarching story that I call the red line of redemption that we follow from Genesis 3:15 all the way through to the marriage, the wedding of the Lamb in Revelation. And we'll take a look at the prophetic voices, because you guys are going to be introduced to two of the most famous prophets. I mean, these are the ones, Elijah and Elisha, they are two of the most profound prophets that are in the text that don't have like their own writings. Isaiah has the biggest book as far as prophets, but Jeremiah has the most content. And so you have these prophets that we know from the text, then Elijah and Elijah. And Elijah is obviously important because he's mentioned throughout the Old Testament, even into the New Testament. So we'll have a good introduction into the prophetic voices and and there somehow. I'm also a nerd when it comes to stuff. I mean, if you haven't can't tell, I've got, Lord of the Rings here, and I've got a sticker up here that's from a video game. And I've got a sticker over here that says, "Not all who wander are lost." When I was in Panama and I was teaching, and I had my laptop up, and one of the students asked, "He's like, is that Hebrew?" He didn't know Lord of the Rings, and I was like, "No, this is way nerdier than that." It'd be one thing if I had Hebrew on mine. And then I actually had a nerd conversation with somebody in Hurlock about how cool it would be if we had a Bible in Elvish. And I Googled it, and I think there is one, anyways. So this is where we are going to be going this week. In order to understand this part of Israel's history, it's really important that we understand where they've come from, okay? That's going to be pivotal to understand what's going on, is what they've come from. And so let's take a look at where they've come from. After Moses and the Exodus from Egypt, the Old Testament narratives concern the working out of the covenantal land promises in Israel's national history. The history falls into 4 large blocks. Okay, so the first one that you guys talked about is the conquest and the settlement of the land. That's in Joshua. Okay, this is when the tribes come in. They actually do the conquest. Well, they begin the conquest of the land. And then the 12 tribes are established there as far as the land allotments. And then we get into what you guys just came out of, is the United Monarchy under Saul, and then David, and that is, the United Kingdom. This week, we're going to get into the divided kingdom. You have 10 tribes that are part of the kingdom of Israel, and then the kingdom of Judah consists of 2 tribes, which is Judah and Benjamin. Levi is not mentioned in this list. In fact, one of my favorite questions to ask students is, how many tribes are there? How many tribes are there? Well, how many tribes are there?
Depends on how you count.
How many tribes?
When you count.
Yeah, how many tribes?
12.
How many?
12, and then what's his name? Joseph's tribe divided into like.
Well, yeah, how many tribes? 13.
And so when you count.
Well, there's 13 tribes because there's the 12, and then there's Levi. Levi doesn't get an allotment of land in the nation because their inheritance is the Lord. And so then Manasseh splits into 2, so you could technically make an argument for 14. But as far as land allotments go, you have 12, and that becomes symbolic for the entire nation of Israel. You guys talked about the symbolism in Numbers?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, good. Because it's not an accident that there's 12 tribes of Israel and that Jesus has 12 disciples in the New Testament. Okay, that is a purposeful, symbolic thing that Jesus did to symbolize like the new people of God. And then you have, which we'll get into in the next few weeks, you have the exile and return. Okay, so this all has to do with the Abrahamic covenant and the working out of the land as part of the Abrahamic covenant, is them coming in, then ruling it, being divided, and then when they come back, when they're sent into exile, they lose the land. And then when they come back, they're never the land is much smaller, and they never have a king who sits on a physical throne. When they come back from exile, they are vassals, and they stay that way. Does this make sense? You guys have any questions thus far? I'm also perfectly comfortable standing in silence. Like if I ask if there are any questions, like I'm perfectly comfortable standing there and waiting. I also know that there are internal processors and external processors. So were you about to ask a question?
No, actually, I was just going to ask if we could open the window.
Oh, okay. I mean, that is a question. Yes.
What happened to the tribe of Simeon? It's like within the tribe.
Yeah, Simeon's allotment was within the tribe of Judah, so they have this little blip in the middle of Judah. I don't know if that's just because they were a smaller tribe. I don't know if they just had to rely on Judah. They eventually kind of get absorbed into Judah. Yeah. There's nothing in the text that gives an indication as to why that is. It was just whenever they divided up the land, it said Simeon had this thing within Judah, and it could be that they were just a smaller tribe and they needed the protection of a larger tribe like Judah. But we do see that eventually they're just kind of absorbed into the bigger tribe of Judah. Good question. That was also a good question.
Could it have to do with like the kind of curse and Jacob gave on the plants?
You know, so there might be something in there that indicates as to that might be why. You also see that the tribe of Dan, I don't know if you guys saw a map of where the allotments are, but the tribe of Dan is supposed to be a map. The tribe of Dan is supposed to be right here, but they end up here. You see that? Here, and then up here. Where the tribe of Dan is supposed to be, oh, yeah. We can use this real quick.
They also made them up themselves.
Okay, good. Yeah, so you see, this is where Dan is supposed to be. Like safely insulated by all the tribes in the north and by Judah in the south. But they struggle so hard to conquer the land, they are kind of effectively driven out by the Canaanites. And they end up settling way up here, up to the north. And you have a tribe that struggled really like they have a tribe that struggled a lot in warfare. They are the ones that are like, when Assyria comes down and starts conquering, they're like the first ones that kind of get swallowed up. We actually never hear from the tribe of Dan again. When the tribes are mentioned again in Revelation, Dan is not mentioned in there. And there's no real indication, curse otherwise as to why that is. So it could be something in the curse, in the thing that when Joseph was blessing, there could be something in there. But the text is largely silent onto why. I mean, there might be some kind of cultural study that you could do as to find out why. But I think it just could be the size of the tribe and where they were, and then eventually just kind of got absorbed into Judah. Any other questions? It's good. All right. So here is the history of the monarchy laid out for you by book. In 1 Samuel, you see the life of Samuel, who is the last judge, and he's the guy who anoints the first two kings. We look at the kingship of Saul, then the rise of David, and then David as a hunted outlaw. It was really cool in those books as you see the rise and decline of Saul, and as Saul is declining, you have the rise of David, and then you see in detail the decline of David. And 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles. 1 Chronicles is kind of a partner to 1 and 2 Samuel. In this, you have David's completion of the conquest of Canaan and David's ideal kingship, and then Chronicles looks at the court history of David. Chronicler's history, you really won't read any negative things about the kings in the Chronicles, and we'll talk about why here in a little bit. And then 1 and 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, this is Solomon's kingship, the division of the monarchy, the history of the divided monarchy, and then spoiler alert, Israel's exile and Judah's exile. And there are two histories that are embedded in the record of the Hebrew Bible. You have what's called the Deuteronomistic history. Why are you trying to say that 5 times fast? In here, this is covered in Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. This is the conquest, the tribal league, united monarchy, divided monarchy, and exile. The Chronicler's history focuses on genealogies. 1 Chronicles has the genealogy of basically Judah, Benjamin, and Levi. It focuses on David and Solomon, the history of Judah, and it talks about the rebuilding of the temple and the rebuilding of Jerusalem. So Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah is all part of what we call the Chronicler's history. You can see the different viewpoints that each one of these histories takes. Are you guys okay?
Are you gonna, pass on your slides?
Yes,
Okay,
I'm not done with them yet,
that's fair.
but when I'm finished with them, you will get them. Yeah. Okay. Taking a look at the differences between Kings and Chronicles. In Kings, you have a prophetic perspective. It's looking at the political history. Wars are emphasized in the book of Kings. You have a record of both nations, meaning a record of Israel and Judah. It says the continuing history of nations. Man's unfaithfulness is really highlighted within the history of the kings. It talks about Solomon and it goes into detail about Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And then it just kind of goes in, and all of the kings' lives are kind of summed up in like a verse or two, and whether or not they followed in the sins of their father, or whether or not they followed in the footsteps of David. The original readers for the Book of Kings are exiles in Babylon. And then, am I going too fast? I'm going to. When I was teaching in Norway and in Hurlock, all of the students hand wrote their notes.
Wow.
Which was weird for me. I hand wrote all my notes in my DBS too. I felt bad for my grader because I don't have good handwriting. Because I hand wrote all my homework too. And it was just like so weird. And also like Europeans don't outwardly emote that much compared to Americans. Like when I teach in Kona, people are like, oh, they get like excited about stuff. Like whenever I would like bring some kind of like historical background or something that was like really amazing in a group full of like Europeans, they're just like. And I'm like, did you guys not hear me? And they're like I was in the school that I led in Norway, you know, all of them were Europeans, except for one girl from New Zealand. And this, bless her, this girl in the back would like raised her hand and said, I took the note. I was like, oh. So I had to adjust my expectations. You know, because in Kona, you'll have people be like, oh, you know, flip tables and pick and I'm like, yeah. Like you can tell that they really enjoyed it. Like in Europe, I had to adjust my expectations to hearing the increase in the typing on the computer. So it's like whenever I would bring something and I would hear, I'd be like, yeah. But then when I taught in Norway, there was no like comforting tickety tack of the keyboards. It was just this. I was like, is this good? Or is this good? Anyways, Chronicles. Chronicles is written from a priestly perspective. So you get the difference, and we'll talk about later on this week, like the role of prophet. Okay, because nowadays in the church now, the role of prophet is kind of like elevated as oh, you're a prophet, right? Like when we'll look at what that looked like in the Old Testament. But Chronicles is written from a priestly perspective. Instead of the political history, this looks at the religious history. The temple is emphasized in the chronicler's history. This is focusing in just on the record of Judah. There's a reason why the chronicler is only focusing on Judah. We'll talk about that later. I have to keep you wanting more and coming back. You're gonna come back anyway, you don't have a choice. Well, you do have a choice. But you know, there are consequences to choices, you know.
Okay.
we see the continuity of David's line instead of the continuing history of the nations of Israel and Judah. It just focuses on David's line in Chronicles. God's faithfulness is highlighted in Chronicles versus man's unfaithfulness in the king's history. And here is why we have a different thing that's focused. This is why the chroniclers have a different focus, is because their original readers are the returned exiles to Jerusalem. There are 5 different types of historical narrative. Chronicles is historical narrative. And one of the types that, I forget all 5, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said 5, now you're like, what are they? If you're really curious, I'll have to look up my notes. But one of these styles of historical narrative is called Abraham Lincoln historical narrative. You guys, I mean, Americans will know who Abe Lincoln is. Anybody else know who Abe Lincoln is? What is Abe Lincoln like? What's a common thing that we say about Abe Lincoln? It's like one of the things that comes to mind.
Honest Abe.
Honest Abe. Honest Abe is the thing that people say about Abraham Lincoln. He was a politician, so honesty was probably not a high priority for Abraham Lincoln. But the thing that he did for America was so significant in freeing the slaves, the Emancipation Proclamation, like what he did for our nation is so important that we are going to remember him in a positive light. Honest Abe, man who can tell no lie, because we want to look back at what he did in this positive way of things. That's what the chronicler's history is like. They are looking at the good things that the kings did. They're looking at the positive things that happened because they have just come back from exile and they need something to look back at of, we have positive things in our history. These are the things that we need to focus on, and it's because they need something positive to look forward to. Amen. That's why Chronicles is written in a different style, and why it just focuses on God's faithfulness, looking at the temple, looking at how David rebuilt the temple and he reinstituted the tribe of Levi and all of this stuff. It's a good look back on Judah. Make sense? Have you guys seen what the Hebrew Bible looks like? The Hebrew Bible is basically the Old Testament. And so these are the books that are in the Hebrew Bible. And I don't have numbers up here, but there's fewer books in the Hebrew Bible than there are in the Old Testament. And you notice they end their Bible with Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. Yeah, fewer books in the Hebrew Bible because they have this thing called the 12, which is just all the what we call minor prophets. And minor prophet is not called minor prophet because they weren't important. It just means that we don't have as much written record of what they did. With Isaiah, we have a whole lot, and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. You notice that Daniel is not in the prophets. The Jews, he wasn't a prophet. He had prophetic dreams and he interpreted prophetic dreams. They had him in the writings portion. But you see, they don't have 1st and 2nd Samuel. They don't have 1st and 2nd Kings. They viewed these as one work. And it wasn't divided into 1st and 2nd until Jerome, I think in the 3rd century, who translated the Bible into Latin, the Latin Vulgate. And then it was done so the Bible could be put in codex form. You guys know what a codex is? This is a good example of a codex. It's anything that's held together with a spine. And so it's records or anything that has a spine that holds something together is a codex. So your Bible is a codex. When you have these huge scrolls, it's hard to put these huge scrolls into something that's bound together with a spine. And so Jerome divided it up into 1st and 2nd, and I'm pretty sure it was Latin. Don't quote me on this. I'm pretty sure it was a Latin translation that brought us chapter and verse divisions, because the Bible wasn't originally written with chapter and verse in mind.
Last week said it was Greeks.
Yeah, oh yeah, maybe let's do a chapter and verse. Yeah. Okay, let's go ahead and take like a short stretch break. Need a pee. Do that now. I mean, go to the restroom and do that if you need to.
Let's come back at 10:15.
Yeah.
Norway?
Yes. Jacob's life wasn't the best. You see consequences for Jacob's life. You see consequences in Abraham and Isaac, and you see David, you see all of this stuff. And one of my interpretation is I think this is part of that is not following that. That's just my thought. You guys okay?
Yeah, but I was just saying, they were kings, so how can we know that it was just the kings having multiple wives?
Oh, well, you have Jacob had two wives because Laban had two daughters and he gave him both of those. That was part of his deception to have Jacob work for him for longer. And then they had maidservants, but you do see that they were wealthy. They had, back then, wealth was measured by flocks and herds. And so you can see that he had a whole lot of animals and flocks and herds, and that's why he was able to support the fact that have multiple wives and multiple children. Yeah, but for a king, it was a mark of power if you were to have multiple wives and lots of concubines. Because the king saw somebody who was really beautiful. It's like, oh, well, I want her. I don't want anybody else to have her. I want her to be my concubine. And the odds of Solomon had 700 wives and 100 concubines. The odds of him being with all of them are pretty low. But it's the fact of look how powerful I am, and nobody else can have you, but I can. Bringing in that much is a mark of, in those days, in the worldly view, it is a mark of power. It's also kind of a mark of pride. It's like, I don't want anybody else to have you. You're going to be, yeah. Makes sense, kind of. I mean, not fun, right? But okay. So, you guys know chiasm? Have you guys had anybody teach you what chiasms are? No? Some people say yes, some people say no. Okay. A chiasm is a form of literary writing. It's like a burger. Okay. A burger, you have the top bun, right, with some sesame seeds on it. And then you have meat here in the middle. Then you have the bottom bun. Okay, you can see I'm not an artist. This is important to the burger. This is also important to the burger, but the most important part of the burger is what's in it. Okay, this is basics of a chiasm. Is you're going to see, and like the top part is bread, the bottom part is also bread. They're both the same thing. This is what we're going to see in chiasm style literary writing, where you're going to have multiple different stories. And you guys may have noticed that you're reading stuff in the Bible and all of a sudden you're reading the same thing again. You're like, wait, didn't I just read this a minute ago? It's because an author will write a story and then write another story and then have something that's really important and then repeat ideas and then repeat ideas. And this is a literary form of writing that is pointing you, the reader, to what their main idea or point is what's in the middle. You guys remember in Exodus? When you're reading God giving them the tabernacle measurements, and then later on you read the tabernacle measurements again, and you're like, oh no, why is it twice? What's in the middle? It's the golden calf stories. That's the author pointing you to the fact that something important is going on in between these similar narratives. Okay? This is a common way of writing in these days that the people back then wouldn't have had to struggle to find. Like, we have to struggle to look for and find chiasms, but this is a normal way of writing back then, okay? So, when you're reading things and you notice that things like the book of Ruth is a chiasm. Ruth begins with the family being empty, and then it ends with the family being full. So there are similar ideas here, and then you have something in the middle that is similar here, and then you have similar, and then the middle is the kinsman redeemer is found. And that's like the thing that the author is pointing you to, is that there is a kinsman redeemer and the redemption of Naomi, okay? Chiasm? Yeah, okay. Yes?
Yeah.
Yes,
Chiasm is something that I love chiasms. And it is something that you can get like fully lost in, because there's a lot of. And like, I mean, even the days of creation is in chiastic pattern. And you can even, if you Google chiasm, you'd be like, chiasm is pretty powerful. It's like there's chiasms all over the place. But we're gonna take a look at these books as a chiasm. So the former prophets as a chiasm. You have Joshua, which is about entering the land. Then you have the book of Judges, which is them ruling the land poorly, but them ruling the land. And then in the book of Samuel, you have highlighted David. And then in Kings, you have them ruling the land poorly. And then in the book of Second Kings, it's them exiting the land and going into exile. So this is the former prophet books as a chiasm, with Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, highlighting the importance of David. And so here we are at the kind of the exiting point of the chiasm within the former prophets. Do you guys see that?
yes.
There's also, is there a chiasm within the story of David? You have David anointed as king to be, and then in 2nd Samuel, you have the promise of the Davidic covenant, and then David anointed king in rulership. So you can see a chiasm within the life of David. Our structure is now moving from the main point. The main point was David. And now we're in the back half of this chiasm, which is into exile from the land. So that is what's going on in 1st and 2nd Kings. Make sense?
Yes.
One of the things that we saw in Joshua is that radical obedience is what got them into the land. That's one of the things that we say marks the Joshua generation, is radical obedience. The first thing that they did was circumcise the whole nation, and that takes radical obedience too, as a 20-year-old male to be circumcised. Yeah, that was something that was supposed to be done on the 8th day after a child was born, that they clearly didn't do. But being obedient to the Lord is what brought them into the land. And now we're going to look at radical disobedience will be the thing that gets them out of the land. And this disobedience is really highlighted a lot in these books. That's one of the things that makes the Bible a unique history of the nation versus when you look at history of every other nation. You look at the history of Assyria, you're never going to read in Assyrian history defeats. In fact, in Assyrian history, in 2nd Kings, I believe it is, it has the Assyrians, they have the capital of Jerusalem surrounded, and they've put them under siege, and in there it says that they're boiling their children to eat them, and their things have gotten really, really bad. Sorry, it's really bad in the nation of Judah. And in Assyrian history, there's actually like, and I have like a picture of this, like, I think it's a stela or something in history where the it's Shalmaneser, one of the Assyrian kings, talks about how he had King Hezekiah caged in like a bird. And then you'll read that the Spirit of God will go out and kill, and the text it says 180,000 Assyrians, and then he goes home. In Assyrian history, it just says that he had Hezekiah hedged in like a bird, and then they just decided that they weren't going to do it anymore, and they went home. Doesn't talk about, waking up and their army being killed. They're not gonna talk about defeat. Because that's not something that they want to remember. In Egyptian history, you're not gonna read about their victory, about their defeats. You're gonna read a lot about their victories. In fact, in Egyptian history, you have the Pharaoh from the Exodus who we don't really know who it is. It's not Ramses. We think it's Amenhotep II. But in Egyptian history, you have this king who was, history is written about the firstborn son of this Pharaoh. And then all of a sudden, nothing else is written about that firstborn son. And then all of the history is now about the secondborn son. The firstborn son isn't mentioned again. That's funny. Why would you stop writing about one of the sons of Pharaoh?
One of the ones who died.
And also, that Pharaoh never did any major conquering after a certain amount of time. You read about his victories before, and all of a sudden he doesn't really do much militarily anymore. I wonder why that is. Maybe it's because their army was wiped out in the Red Sea. So sometimes the absence of stuff in foreign history is evidence for stuff in the Bible, because they're not going to record their failures. Whereas in the Bible, you're going to read graphically about the failure of the nation. I mean, a whole chapter is dedicated to David's sin with Bathsheba, and then him essentially murdering Uriah, and then all of the consequences of that. And why do you think that is? Why do you think in the Bible you read about the failure of the people of God so much? Why is that?
We can learn from it.
Okay,
So you can see God's power.
It's
not
because-
people's power.
the Bible is not about Israel.
Mhm.
It's not about you. It's about how great God is. The Bible highlights how poorly the people of Israel are because the main hero of the Bible is God.
Amen.
God is the ultimate protagonist in the Bible. So when David is used mightily by the Lord and then he fails spectacularly, it's not David's story.
Mm.
When you read about Solomon and then him failing, it's not Solomon's story. I mean, Moses murdered a guy. In fact, if we were to make a list of accomplishments, we were making a list of David's accomplishments and then David's failures, all of you guys would be like, I would disqualify David from being called a great man. He was an adulterer and he was a murderer. What does the Bible say about David? He's a man after God's own heart.
Except you're right.
Because it's not about David. It's about God using David despite how fallen he is. It's not about who you are. It's not about what you look. In fact, who can tell me what David looks like?
God.
Well, he was rude, he was dark, and had beautiful eyes.
I'm drawing. How do you draw ruddy, beautiful eyed, handsome men? What does Moses look like? Nowhere in the text are we going to find enough physical description about somebody to draw an accurate picture. Because the Bible doesn't care what you look like. The Bible cares about your heart. In fact, it says so. 1 Samuel 16:7.
Yep.
It says, do not look on his physical appearance because I have rejected him. The Lord doesn't care about your outward appearance, he cares about your heart. And that is one of the big things in the Bible is God doesn't care what you look like. God doesn't care, if the world thinks you're attractive or not. It doesn't matter. God cares about, are you willing to be used by the Lord? Are you willing for God to move through you? In the New Testament, it says that we have this treasure in jars of clay. We are those jars of clay. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering, because when you were reading, it was just funny to realize that there was still like an emphasis about like Saul and David and stuff, that they're always described as like, oh yeah, they're handsome and everything. And it's just mentioned as a way of qualification where like, we know it's not, but it's not like, why is that such a big thing? Like, why is it supposed to be mentioned?
Why is it supposed to be
Oh,
mentioned?
like, for Saul, it was said like, oh yeah, there's this man and he's like,
Oh, yeah, he was head and shoulders above everybody else, and he was super good looking, a
Yeah,
lot like
he's-
me.
exactly,
Like,
and then it's like, and it's like, and he's gonna be king, and you're like, but, okay, I mean, he can be king, like, but the whole part before has.
The
to do
whole,
with
the
it.
whole point of that is that that's what the people looked for in a king.
Yeah.
The people looked at him and were like, yeah, that's a king. Tall, good looking, that's the guy we wanna follow. But then it's shown that that's actually not qualities of somebody that you wanna follow. And David, you know, it does say that he was ruddy and he had beautiful, I don't know why the author included that. But here's the thing, it's only mentioned briefly, and the Bible talks a lot about David as a man. And what he does and who he was and how he feared the Lord and the content of who he was. The Bible might give you one verse on the fact that somebody was good looking. But then it spends a lot of time about Solomon as a man and Solomon and what he did, and then his downfall is highlighted pretty graphically. Why do they include that detail? I don't know. But you see the amount of time that it's spent on physical appearance versus the time it's spent on content of who you are as a person. We can see which one the Bible considers to be more important, isn't it?
And then the funny thing about Absalom is that it actually goes on a little bit about how good looking he was and the incredible and the weight of it.
Oh,
He got it
yeah.
once a year, but in the end it becomes his dad.
Yeah. Yeah, and like that's one of the things, because again, he started to like deceive people and bring people away, and like. That's one of the downfalls of people. If I was like 6'4", you would believe me a lot more. You would, you just would.
That's why Lauren is so tall.
Because people are tall, for some reason, we look at people's height and we go, oh, they must be a good leader. It's really silly. It has no bearing on, because I've been around tall people who are idiots. I mean, like, you couldn't lead people out of a burning paper bag. It doesn't matter how big or tall people are. It shows Absalom, he was really good looking and he had long hair and this lustrous hair. And it became a pride, it became a point of pride from him. They got caught. That's a funny picture of them to see a guy caught by his hair in a tree. All right, so we have the annals and history of the king. We're looking at Kings. Kings goes into why did we go into exile versus Chronicles history is how do we not go back into exile. You're gonna have these things that are mentioned in Kings where it says, you know, where it doesn't, like some Kings doesn't go into very much detail at all. And it says the rest of their acts, are they not written in the annals of the kings of? So it's clear that there are other writings that they did of a king's court history, that those have been lost to history. So Kings, we see the house of David with Judah, and then we have the house of Jeroboam and Omri and Jehu, etc. The biblical definition of king is laid out for us in Deuteronomy chapter 17. In fact, I want somebody to turn there real quick, because we'll read that here in a second. So just somebody get those scriptures prepared. But this is, so God knew that one day they would have a king. And so God in Deuteronomy in the law laid out what a king is supposed to look like. So in Judah, it's only the house of David. But in Israel, you have a lot of dynasty overturn. You have a lot of intrigue, you have a lot of assassination, you have a lot of different houses that rule. And in Deuteronomy, the Mosaic covenant is in the form of a suzerainty covenant. You guys heard that phrase before? Yeah.
I heard it, but I forgot.
Suzerainty covenant, it's a covenant between a greater party or a lesser party, or a lord and a vassal. And we'll look at how that is played out in the lives of the kings. Prophets in this book, you have guys like Nathan, Ahijah, Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, and a whole bunch of unnamed prophets. You also have false prophets. You have this funny interaction with this guy, Micah or Micaiah or something with, I think it's Ahab, where they're like, come be a prophet and only prophets have good things. So he comes in, he's like, oh, bless the Lord. And he's like really sarcastic and king. It's like, how many times have I done that? But you have false prophets, a lot of false prophets during the time. The biblical definition of prophet is laid out for us in Deuteronomy 18. And one of the things of a prophet is that they are actually anointed into the office of prophet. This is a role that that the people needed because they still have the tabernacle or the temple, and the Spirit of God is behind the veil. And so they can't just go and pray to the Lord and hear his voice like we can today. We have access to the Spirit through Jesus and through Jesus's death, the giving of the Spirit. So we now can go and hear the leading of the Lord. Back then they could not. And so there was somebody who was anointed into the role of prophet to be able to speak the will of the Lord. And that was the person that they would go to. In fact, in a king's court, there were three important people in the court of the king. I erased my hamburger here. There were three roles in the king's court that were really important. You had a prophet, at least this is what they were supposed to have. Okay, they were supposed to have a prophet, they were supposed to have a priest, and they were supposed to have a wise guy. These are three people that the king is supposed to have to advise him. You're supposed to have a prophet who's supposed to be able to give him what the Lord is saying. You're supposed to have a priest who's supposed to hold him to the covenant and help him keep that. And then you need a wise person to obviously give you wise advice on how to rule a nation. So these are three roles that a king is supposed to have in his court. And we're going to see how some of these kings either don't have or they have people in this role to just kind of tell them what they want.
Is that a ancient Near East tradition, or is this the biblical tradition?
I think it's both. They would have somebody who would be the voice of their God, and then a priest, and then somebody wise. And this is something that it's a good idea, right? It's a good idea to have. If I'm a ruler, if I was in a place of rulership, I would definitely want somebody there to help advise me in the ways that I'm supposed to be a king.
How do you qualify as a wise guy?
Track record.
Whether or not you're connected with the right family. That's a good question. I don't rightly know what are the qualifications for a wise person. But we do see when you guys get to 1 Kings 11 or 12 or something, when Rehoboam takes over and Jeroboam comes and like gives him a request, and he goes and he consults the older guys for wisdom, and then he goes to his buddies, and you can see the difference in the advice that they give. I would qualify one of the things of a wise guy would be experience. You know, like, do you guys have mentors in your life? If you don't have a mentor, I recommend that you get one. I recommend that you find one that is, if you're a guy, find a guy. If you're a girl, find a girl. Find somebody who's older than you, and find somebody who is successful in areas of life that you also want to be successful in. Okay. I have people that I consider mentors in my life, people who are successful husbands, successful fathers, and successful in their ministry, because those are the things that I want in my life. So if you don't have a mentor, find one. Amen.
Amen.
Man,
Okay. This is a quote from a guy named Matthew Henry. He says, "In all this history, it appears that kings, those gods to us, are men to God. mortal and accountable. In the ancient Near East tradition of kings, the kings represented God to the people. They were representative of whatever God, like in Egypt with Pharaoh, where God, like the 10 signs or the 10 plagues were all against Egyptian gods, and the final sign was against Pharaoh himself. Because Pharaoh is representative of God to the people. And so gods to them, this is going to show that they are mortal and accountable to the one true God as we go through these books. You guys following me okay? Yep. Tracking with me? Any questions or anything so far? What are you writing? Okay.
Totally.
It's not good that I have a laser pointer.
Actually, I don't know if you can answer that question though, because it's kind of like,
Try me. Oh, before you ask. I do say that I love questions and I want you to ask questions, but I'm gonna answer most of your questions right now. I don't know. That's gonna be my response to a lot of questions. I don't know. There are so many things in the Bible that there's so many things in the Bible that we just don't know. There are also so many things in the Bible that I just don't know. However, I will try to give you my best educated response based on observation and other things that I've seen. So if you ask a question, I'm gonna be very honest. Well, I don't know, but here's my thought. So sorry, go ahead.
yeah, so.
I don't know, sorry.
Yeah, it's a high possibility. I just really got it though. And so before when Jacob came to Israel and like, well, not Israel, when Jacob came into Egypt and they already called the Pharaoh, but like at that time they were only kings.
Right.
So the Bible still calls him a Pharaoh, or like the ruler at that time of Pharaoh, even though in that way he doesn't exist. Why is that?
So for stuff like that, you need to consider author and audience. Moses is the author, and the audience are the people who are wandering in the wilderness. So that is language that they grew up with. They grew up with pharaohs being rulers, and that's 400 years enslaved to Egypt. And so that's what they would have understood. That's why I think Moses uses terms like Pharaoh when Pharaoh wasn't there yet until the shift of power, because that's what they would have been familiar with. At least that's my thought.
Okay.
There are some things that you need to take into account author and audience. And, you know, Moses grew up in the court of Egypt, so that's what he knew was Pharaoh. So that's my thought to that.
Okay.
Good question. All right, we're almost on big time break. All right, authorship of the book. Now, the books are formally anonymous. So there's nobody in this book that says, like when you get to prophets, it's pretty easy to identify the author of the prophet because it says, this guy prophesied during the year of this guy, this guy. And so there are people where you can see, or other times there are books that like Moses never says, I, Moses, am writing this, but you do see internal evidence that supports Mosaic authorship. In these books, the authors are anonymous, though they were composed using pre-existing sources that haven't survived. Book of the Acts of Solomon, Book of the Annals of the Kings of Israel, that's mentioned 18 times. The Annals of the Kings of Judah, that's mentioned 15 times. And also Isaiah 36 through 39 parallels the story of Kings 18 through 20. You do have evidence in the text that prophets kept written records. Samuel dies very early on in the story. In 1 Samuel, he's dead, but then all of the story is titled Samuel. But Nathan and Gad are the prophets who kind of took over in the role of prophet for Samuel, and they are the ones who probably continue to keep records. So a lot of these books that are anonymous, the tradition is to ascribe them to some kind of prophet or Ezra, because Ezra was a scribe, and he's described as a scribe. And so scribes keep written records, and so that's one of the things that we usually land on. But a lot of this stuff was already written, and so an author, so this whoever is compiling this stuff is taking evidence from some of these things and then compiling together. The ancient Jews believed that Jeremiah wrote Kings. And and part of that is like, there's a section in one of them, I think it's the end of Second Kings, which is like almost word for word from a section in Jeremiah. And it's like, who copied who? So this is one of the support where we think Jeremiah is possibly an author to what it is going on. He was alive during some of the king's rulers towards the end. Where if he, it's just an old tradition, if he wrote it, where did he write it? Did he write it in Egypt? How is it brought back into either Israel or into captivity? Because at some point in Jeremiah's life, he flees to Egypt. Most people believe that someone compiled many old documents, perhaps a few groups of people over hundreds of years, and all of those pooled accounts were eventually assembled at the beginning of the exile. Doesn't really matter who authored it. It's not a super important thing. One thing that is important is that we do have written records of what's going on. And a lot of that stuff has been, what's the word? Preserved, yeah, but also verified through other external sources, other histories, like the history, like there's a Moabite stela, which talks about, like Jehu bringing tribute, and there's this thing of Shalmaneser, which has all of this stuff. So traditionally, the Jews ascribe these books to Jeremiah. There's no external or internal evidence for that, but we do know that it was compiled for the people in exile, so they could see what was going on, why they made it into exile, and then for Ezra and Chronicles, how they can avoid going into exile. All right, let's stop here. We'll go to break now.
You're trying to.
Maybe. It's just not that I have. I mean, you can see the buttons that I push more the most on this thing is the button to advance the slides and the laser. Sometimes I actually use it for what it's supposed to be. I'll be like, here, but it doesn't work on the screen. So otherwise, then I'm like, what note are you taking?
Hey.
Okay, well, welcome back from the break, and let's once again welcome Daniel. Go for it, Daniel.
All right. Okay, you guys ready to move forward, or we got questions or anything?
Nope.
Like I said, please ask questions. And if I'm in the middle of a thought when you have a question, then I'll be like any good Pentecostal preacher, and I'll say, I see that. And then I see that. See it. Okay, so the original readers are Israelites in captivity in Babylon. They're wondering how they got there and why, and wondering how things can be put back together again. So these are the people who would be reading this compiled history of the nation. Because when you guys get to next week, when you get the prophets, Jeremiah is going to predict that they're going to go into exile for 7 years. And so while they're there, you have somebody who compiled this, and so they can have this history. It kind of tells them how they got to where they were at. All right, the structure. It falls into 3 chronological blocks. The first block is we're going to look at the kingship of Solomon. This is in 1 Kings 1 through 11. This focuses in on Solomon. And then the next section is the kings of the divided monarchy. This starts in 1 Kings chapter 12 and goes all the way through 2 Kings chapter 17. So I'm not just looking at the structure of 1 Kings, I'm looking at structure of kings. Okay, so both of the books. And then the third part is looking at the last kings of Judah, and this is in 2 Kings 18 through 25, because at one point the northern kingdom gets exiled, and we'll talk about that. But here is how the structure is. So effectively it covers the death of Solomon all the way to the death of the nation. figuratively, the death of the nation. But, you know, kind of literally, because they come back and they're still a people group, but they never have a kingdom or a nation like they had before. They are vassals to other nations. So some of the themes that we are going to see here is Solomon's reign becomes paradigmic, this is, yeah, that one. This is one of Dan Lewis's slides. It becomes like a picture of what's going on for the whole nation. His reign began in obedience and blessing, and it ended in disobedience and disillusion. And this is gonna be something we're going to look at a lot, is if you hold to the covenant, then you'll be blessed. If you move away from the covenant and you're disobedient, then you will be cursed. Each successive king is evaluated with respect to covenant faithfulness. Without exception, the northern kings were judged as covenant violators and thoroughly evil. There are 19 kings. 20, if you count like the Queen region or whatever. All of them are, they're all bad all the time. There's not one king in the north that is good. And when we get to Jeroboam, we'll talk about why that is, okay? But everybody in the north is bad, and like they're judged on whether or not they followed the sin of Jeroboam, who's the king, the first king north. In the south, 2 kings were given unqualified commendation, meaning there are only 2 kings, and 20 also, I think it's something like that, 19. There's about that many kings in the south as well. And only 2 of them, nothing bad is said of their reign, where it says that they walked like completely in the footsteps of their father. Do you guys know who those kings are? Josiah. Staff, you can't answer, you'll know. Josiah and Hezekiah are the 2 kings that nothing bad is said about them. Several of them were partially commended, and the rest were judged as thoroughly evil. So you have a few kings, like I know Asa, it says, at least in Kings, it says that he did good things and he was a good king, but he also didn't eliminate certain things. And then it goes into more detail in Chronicles. So only 2 guys are like, they were good. The rest of them, they had some form of failing. Content, historically, it covers from the death of David. So David is still alive at the beginning of Kings. So it covers the death of David in 970 BC, all the way to the final exile of Judah in 586. There aren't a whole lot of dates that are really important for you to know in the Bible, but 586 is one of these super important dates. It's super important. 586 is a really important, it's super important, this date of 586 BC. Because this is the final exile where the nation is destroyed, taken into exile by Babylon. So 586, if you remember no other dates, there's two dates in the text that you need to remember if you remember none others. 586 and 722, I don't know if I have it up here, but 722 BC, that is the exile of the northern kingdom of Israel. So those are 2 pivotal moments, 722, 586. lays out all of the curses that you'll get for breaking the covenant, and they literally. That they don't do. And so God visits judgment on them, and he uses the foreign nations as his way of bringing back. And then we'll see the role of the prophets during this time. When do we end?
Oh, 1 o'clock. Is that,
Okay.
yeah, you can break in between.
Yeah, definitely.
Yay.
Well, I'm drinking water and I have coffee and all that, so I'll definitely. Also, please ask questions. Yeah,
Why is it? Because what is left in the exile, last exile was the tribe of Judah, line of David. Why does it their name becomes Israel when they return, or like they are referred to
that
as
is
Israel?
today, Judah.
Oh yeah, they are Judah,
Yeah,
the tribe of David and his line of kings. And when they return from exile, it's always been now kind of is their name Israel. There's an interchange
Right.
between Judah and
yeah.
referring to them as Israel as well. When
I
Israel is
mean,
gone.
originally, that was the intent for the nation to be called Israel.
Mm,
And the meaning of the name Israel is wrestled with God.
mm,
And so we see that throughout their history. But the name Judah, obviously, the king of Judah obviously comes from the tribe of Judah. And when they go into exile, that's the biggest tribe. There's Judah, Benjamin, and Levi that's left, but Judah is like the main one. I don't know if I'm understanding your question.
yeah, somehow it like there's an interchange between. We know that in 722, Israel is
Yeah,
fully
Israel's
gone,
gone.
but somehow there's an interchange looking back at the people of God. The return is they are still Israel.
Yes, the people who return are still, because the nation, there was a differentiation because of the split.
Mm,
The nation, the people are still the people of God, they're still the people of Israel. I think it just depends on authorship and time of authorship as to why they are referred to. Because, it says that, whenever, because Jacob had his name changed to Israel. And there are certain parts of the text where it says the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then it'll say the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. And it'll kind of go back and forth.
mm,
And we see those are kind of interchanged, and I think it's based on authorship and the time in history that the person is writing about. That's my best thought to that is, I mean, you can see overall that the nation of Israel, like these are the people of God, but being so close to the division, they made that distinction. And 70 years exile, and they come back and they live for hundreds of years in the land before Jesus comes. And eventually Israel is kind of, the northern tribe of Israel is kind of forgotten. In fact, spoiler alert, we never hear from the 10 tribes anymore again. Once they're exiled, they're gone. There is a brief mention in the New Testament that's one, like a prophet says that she's from the tribe of Asher, but that's it. We don't hear from the tribes again. And it's because of the way the Assyrians exiled people that the ruled nation of Israel is effectively gone. And so with that dispersion, eventually, I think the association with Israel goes back to just being the people of God. At least that's my thought. Yeah.
So today are the Jewish people, are they still under this, old covenant? Or are they technically under the new covenant?
Well, everybody's under the new covenant. However, you have Jews who do not believe that Jesus was the Messiah. And they don't hold the New Testament to be inspired text.
Mhm.
And so you do have the large, and I don't know a whole lot about, because you do have Messianic Jews who do believe Jesus is the Messiah. But Jews, for the large part, they don't believe Jesus was the Messiah. They're still waiting on those things to be fulfilled. And so they still believe that they're under the old covenant. However, the temple is gone. They don't make sacrifices. And what happened during exile, because whenever they were exiled into Babylon, the temple was destroyed. And so how do you maintain your Jewishness in a nation where there's no temple? Like, where do I worship if there's no center for worship? So during exile, they started to view adherence to the law as their form of sacrifice. They're like, my being obedient to the covenant, my obedience will be my sacrifice. And so that's how the Jews still view things today, is holding to Old Covenant, Old Testament law as a way of doing their own, that's their form of sacrifice, is keeping adherence to the law.
That's why they have so many extra laws to make.
Yes. And whoever is teaching you guys in week 8, when you get into Intertestament, hopefully they'll talk about the additions to the law that they make. Because the Jews have the Hebrew Bible, which they call the Tanakh. Everybody say Tanakh. Tanakh. That is a combination of the Torah, and then you have the Nevi'im, which is messengers or prophets, and then you have the writings, which is called Ketubim. And so they combine the first part of each of those sections to the Tanakh. That's their scripture. But then they also have something called the Talmud. And the Talmud is Jewish oral tradition. And you'll see in the New Testament that the Pharisees hold the Jewish Talmud to be as authoritative as the Old Testament. And this is something that Jesus is coming against, because they have these, like the ceremonial washing of hands. And Jesus is like, how come your disciples don't do this? And they're like, you guys are holding to these ceremonies that aren't part of the law. And Jesus says, like, some of these things have become a millstone around your neck. And so that's why they have all of these additional things. Make sense? Yeah.
About the tribes though, is really so interesting that although we don't hear about them anymore, but they knew they were. Like when they returned finally to Israel again, I mean, they know how to claim, oh, I'm from Dan, I'm from there. They don't.
Not, at least not in the text.
No, not in the Bible.
Yeah.
Not in the Bible, but
1946,
yes,
1946, when Israel became a
nation.
nation again.
So
For the-
there is something like, for all intents and purposes, when northern tribes are exiled, they're gone. And it's the way Assyria exiles people. We'll talk about it a little bit right now, because this is relevant. The way Assyria exiled people was, they were either, they wanted to assimilate them into Assyria, or they didn't want them to ever be who they were again. So like this class, let's say we're all part of the same people group. If I came in and exiled you, I would send you to Germany, and I would send you to Australia, and I would send you to Greenland, and I would send you to where you would never see each other again. And that's how they exiled people, was they scattered them because they didn't want them to be a people group anymore. Or if you were allowed to stay in the land, you were forced to marry an Assyrian and be assimilated into Assyrian way of life. So you do have, you can like have in history, like you have this thing where people call it Russian Judaism. There are some people who believe that the Native Americans in America can trace their heritage back to the 10 tribes of Israel. Those things, I'm sure they can substantiate them, but because of the way Assyria exiled people for all effect, they're gone. Now, I'm not going to look a Jew in the face who says I'm from this tribe and say, no, you're not. Because they could, but it would be so difficult to maintain your history when, if you're a Jew and you're forced to marry an Assyrian, then your child is now half Jew, half Assyrian. And then you're going to be taught the way of the Assyrians. And so then your child is going to be even further deluded. In fact, I'm jumping way ahead. That's why in the New Testament, the Jews hate Samaritans, because they are from the capital of the northern tribes, becomes Samaria. And like, that's where they were blended with foreign, and like in the New Testament, they consider Samaritans to be half people because they're only part Jewish. So I'm sure there are people who can in some way trace their history back to the tribes. I'm not going to take anything away from them, but for like in the text, the text is concerned. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. But with the Assyrian background,
Yeah.
definitely, but the reality, it doesn't really make sense. I mean, like, Second World War, how many Jews, how did they know they were Jews, and how did the oppressors know they were Jews?
Well, most of them, because there's still a big remnant that remained in Babylon. And there were still some Jews they settled in Egypt when they were scattered. You still have Jews living in Egypt, and you had Jews who stayed in Babylon. And so you have a long history of people who can trace their roots back to the tribe of Judah or the tribe of Benjamin or the tribe of Levi. And it could be that these people can trace their roots and history back to these other tribes. But you have this people group that is in Babylon for 70 years, and Jeremiah said, like, have kids, build a life, like you're going to be there for a while. And when they come back from exile, not everybody comes back. Only about 50,000 people come back from exile. So there are Jews who still stay in Babylon. There were Jews who went to Egypt, and went within Jeremiah. Some of them flee to Egypt, and some of them stay there in Egypt. So you have these communities, but those were people from the tribe of Judah. Because by the time it gets to Jeremiah, the northern tribes have already been exiled and scattered. And then you have, the nation of Judah and Benjamin and Levi, who some of them go to Egypt, some of them stay there. They all go. Well, even in the exile, there are 3 exiles. Babylon came in and took the upper crust royalty. Then they came back and took like the well-to-do, like educated merchants and stuff. Then they came back and took the normal commoners. And then they left like farmers in the land to kind of maintain the land. And so then when they come back, and so you have lots of time for the Jews to spread and to grow as a people, and then to, of course, leave under, Persia. So that's how they got to be scattered all over the place. I'm not a historian, so I'm not going to tell a Jew, well, you're not from the tribe of Asher, because you can't prove it. But I'll get into more detail when we start getting into the northern kingdoms and Assyria, because I have a lot of stuff on the brutality of the Assyrians and why God uses the Assyrians to do the exile of the northern tribes. Great question. Anything else? Like, this is fun. I enjoy having this kind of talk and this kind of discussion. In fact, but just one more thing, you don't hear the other tribes mentioned again until Revelation, when it's talking about bringing everything back. In. All right. So an overview. Kings concludes the section in the Hebrew Bible called the Former Prophets. It's called Former Prophets because it lays out the prophetic pattern of being blessed for following the covenant and being cursed for disobedience. Okay, so this is why these books are called Former Prophets, is because it kind of lays out prophetically the pattern of what's going on. And these books, Kings, closes out this section. It concludes this section as a description of judgment on Israel's history. In 1 Kings chapters 1 through 11, 4 things are really important. The first one is how Solomon became king. And then the second one is his request for wisdom, and then him being known for that. He is known for wisdom. In fact, he is known to be the wisest person to ever have lived. The third important thing is the temple construction. That's a really major point in Solomon's history because David wanted to, wasn't allowed to. Said his son will do it, and so David like gathered the resources and everything, so Solomon could do this, and then Solomon constructed the temple. Then he also like builds his own palace, and he builds a palace for his wife. Kind of see hints at some of the undercurrents of things that bring Solomon to an end. And then the fourth thing is that we see is his downfall. Those are four important things in that first section. How he became king, his request for wisdom, temple construction, and then his downfall. Yeah.
I just wondering, what is Solomon's wife?
I don't think any of his wives are actually named. Like while I was reading through, it just says that his first wife is the daughter of Pharaoh. And then it goes into naming the nations that he married daughters from. But it's never mentioned, and I don't know if that's a question that came from Song of Songs. Or if people believe that he married Abishag. There's no support in the text to show that he married Abishag or that Song of Songs is about Abishag. I have strong opinions about some of these things. But we don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, she was David. I was wondering for Solomon because he was so wise, and there was like there's specific situations that I mentioned, like how he like chose very wise, like with God's wisdom. And then on the other hand, on his personal life, he was kind of not so
Interesting, you notice that.
So I'm like, where does his wisdom? I mean, how is it? Can it just be partial? Like just used for a certain area? I don't know, because I mean, David is, for example, also wise in a way, like he's following God and his instructions, and as soon as he does that, he's doing great choices and he wins, and he's blessed in everything. Yeah, and then on his personal life, he's making not so good choices. And how is he like not considered as wise as Solomon when they both did like
Who?
David, for example, David and Solomon,
Yeah.
when they're both like wise in a certain part of their life and not wise in another one.
Okay. So what do you guys think? It's a great question, yeah.
I think there's a difference between being wise and actually applying your knowledge, like the
Okay.
wisdom. We were talking about how the Hebrew knowledge actually applying it, right? And I think that's the difference.
Okay. Good, interesting thought.
What?
What?
I don't understand it. Like, if he didn't apply his wisdom, and the definition of wisdom is applying information or like knowledge, then
It's not wisdom,
yeah. I don't know.
folly.
Maybe he only had wisdom on certain things like ruling people.
Okay, that's an interesting point.
I would still say though, that
Yes.
dramatic. I would still say though, that you can know something is wise and still not do it. Or that you can know about wisdom and you have the knowledge of wisdom, wisdom and not do it. It's still something different, I think.
It doesn't that make you more dumb? Like knowing something is wise to do and you don't do it.
I mean, you can ask yourself, like, how many things do you know you're not supposed to do wrong and still do it?
Yeah, and I'm not saying I'm intelligent in these points, but he's still described as like a wise man, so.
The Bible does describe Solomon as the wisest man ever.
No point.
I don't think it's like the part of fear of the Lord as well. It's
Because it says that that's the foundation of true wisdom, and I think at the start of his reign, he did display that, but at some point he lost it, and I don't know if it was his pride, like, which he would then be won by fear of men, more than fear of the Lord. So I think he still possessed wisdom, but he, because he wasn't governed by the fear of the Lord and one kind of along with him as well.
Good. Let me hear where you guys are at.
What wisdom is, or what?
Just this thought, where Solomon, I mean, the Bible is pretty clear that it says that Solomon asked God for wisdom and God gave him wisdom. So much to the fact that the Queen of Sheba came and like, he had knowledge and wisdom on every topic she could think of. It says that she asked him questions until she was out of breath. I mean, it doesn't mean that she did that. It just means that she exhausted everything that she could think of, and Solomon had a response, an answer for everything. And it says that Solomon wrote all of these proverbs and like over 1,000 songs and all this stuff. So there's evidence that Solomon had wisdom. We see that. But
Well, applying my Western worldview, I
Okay.
think wealth and sex corrupts.
Okay.
And those two things were about his downfall.
that's true. The two big things that brought him down was his accruing of wealth, but in particular horses. That was one of the things that God said in Deuteronomy 17, where it says a king shall not have a butt ton of horses, and he had just that, yeah, a butt ton. For those of you who are unfamiliar, that is a legit unit of measure. There's a ton and then there's a butt ton. And one of the thing with the wives, it wasn't just that, it was the fact that he allowed them to keep their own religion. And he built places for them to worship their own gods. Okay, think about this, okay? Let's say that you are a ruler. And you are surrounded by other nations. And let's say that Daniel is a ruler, and let's say that Jessica is a ruler of a nation right next to him, okay? Or even better, sorry. Daniel's a ruler and Christopher is a ruler. And they are rulers of opposite nations and rulers that have a history of conflict. If he marries Christopher's daughter, is it likely that he's going to come and invade his city? Probably not, because that's where his daughter now lives. Is it likely that he's going to go against his father-in-law? Probably not, because you've entered into some kind of, is that a wise way to rule?
For the world, yeah.
Who said it?
Yes.
That's some pretty good worldly wisdom. It's a pretty smart way to rule, to establish like connections between the cities and the countries that surround you. It's a really wise way to rule, for Daniel to marry the daughter of this kingdom, for Daniel to marry the daughter of that kingdom, for Daniel to have some kind of tie to these kingdoms, because they're probably not going to invade. And if he comes under attack, then he'll probably be able to call to, hey, Christopher, our nations have been friends. Well, I've got this other nation that's coming against me. Can you help? We come down really hard on Solomon as our New Testament Christian worldview. We're like, wives, ha! Look at all the women that you have. What a dummy. But worldly wisdom wise, that's actually a smart way to do things. He was exceedingly wise when it came to administration of the kingdom and how to run the nation politically. And we do see evidence that he was wise. He had knowledge and wisdom on a whole bunch of all these topics. I am a very beloved. He has all of this stuff, but he forgets the main thing that he's not supposed to forget. He doesn't keep the main thing the main thing. What is the main thing?
Covenant.
Obeying the Lord, loyalty to the covenant, that is the main thing. Obeying God, that's our main thing. No matter what we do, we need to always remember the main thing. No matter what it is that we're called to, if we're called to pioneer a base in a place that doesn't have anything, if we're called to do whatever it is, we need to remember that we need to stay true to what the Lord has commanded. And what is the thing that the Lord has commanded? Jesus sums it up pretty well for us. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. But the thing that begins that is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is one. One God, following him. This is what we're supposed to be loyal to, is God, and loving him with everything that we have. And then after we've done that, with people, yeah? Solomon doesn't do that. He starts off okay. But eventually, all of his vaunted wisdom, he allowed his first wife to keep her religion. And that's the thing, is it's written pretty clearly in the law not to marry foreigners. And that doesn't mean just don't marry somebody outside of your own race. That's not what the Bible is promoting, okay? Because there are lots of evidences of what a foreigner is to do if they want to be a part of the people of God, and it's accept and follow Yahweh and all that stuff. He doesn't do that. He is very worldly wise. He really is. He rules the nation really, really well. But the thing that he misses is downfall. Is not just the amount of women. Yes, that's not a wise thing. I feel like it started out as a wise thing to do, marry women from surrounding nations so you have like good alliances, but it got worse and worse and worse and worse. And in fact, it even says that he would go in and worship these other gods. He allowed his heart to be turned. Okay. And then chapters 12 through 14, it goes into what causes the kingdom to split. This was Solomon's son, Rehoboam, with this encounter with Jeroboam, which we'll get into more detail of that later.
Brands of chocolate.
What?
Sounds like chocolate names.
Rehoboam?
Yeah.
I would not eat chocolate called Rehoboam. But it does sound like a fancy chocolate name. Yes, maybe Jeroboam. Once the kingdom is divided, the story goes back and forth between kings in the south and the north, all the way through 2 Kings chapter 17. You kind of have this bouncing back and forth between northern kings and southern kings. And it does get pretty detailed as to who is ruling where and for how long, and whether or not they were good or bad. Who's bad in the north?
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
It's bad.
Who's bad in the north? Kings?
All of them.
All of them?
Oh.
Everybody's bad.
Oh, the two
Everyone.
ones were the south.
Yeah, the southern kingdoms is the only place where they have some good kings. The north, all bad, all the time.
Like 90% are.
Huh?
90% of the kings in general are those,
In the north?
in general.
Oh, yeah, in general, yeah. Most of them are awful. But if there is a good king at any point, it's gonna be an example. Elijah and Elijah feature heavily until the northern kingdom of Israel is exiled in 722 BC. And as we see here, the first evidence of me not closing on parentheses. Nobody saw that. The rest of 2 Kings tells the story of Judah's kings. But once you hit 2 Kings 17, the rest of it is all about the southern king. And it ends with the exile of the southern kingdom of Judah in 586 BC. I'm just giving you the overview of the things that are happening in the book, and then we will go into detail about some of the main points. And then I'll finish my slides and send them to you. I'm still working.
I don't completely understand the sentence,
Which one?
with Elijah and Elisha future heavily.
Which means you're just gonna hear a lot about those guys. Because they are prophets to the north. And so you're going to hear a lot about Elijah and Elisha's ministry. But then when the north is exiled, you don't hear from them again because, well, one of them gets taken up into heaven and the other one dies, but it focuses in on their ministry heavily. Because they are the ones that are called to the north, and things are so bad in the north, it highlights them a lot.
Okay.
It just means that there's a lot written about Elijah and Elisha. That's what feature heavily means. Your notes look really organized from up here.
It's reassuring.
They might be just a mess. So in the southern kingdom, it focuses in on two notably good kings, Hezekiah and Josiah. These are guys who nothing really bad is said about them. In Chronicles, you get a little bit more detail on something that Hezekiah did that wasn't all that great. But as far as ruling, they are the ones who, they got rid of all of the idols, they got rid of all of the high places. Because like Asa, it'll say things like he followed in the ways of David, he got rid of all the stuff, but he didn't eliminate the high places. So it's like he does really good, but there's something that he doesn't do. But Hezekiah and Josiah, all like they did it all. And they brought about reformation and revival during those days. But we're going to see it's not something that continues on. In fact, the worst thing out of all of them is I think it's Josiah's son. Is it Josiah's son or is it Manasseh?
Yeah, Manasseh.
Josiah's son. One of I can't remember which one. It's Josiah Hezekiah. One of his guys who was like the best, his son is literally the worst. Like, not like, oh, he's the worst. No, he's literally the worst.
How do they fail to how do the good things in that way fail to raise
Great
their,
question. How do they fail so fantastically?
and don't they realize, I mean, it has been seen in the past how bad it can become if you don't raise your children, right? Like David was chased and stuff by his child because,
David was not a great father,
yeah,
and we can see here the same thing.
he had a
It's like.
That's a-
Focus on this. Oh, that's.
That is a lesson that you could pull from them. But I think the overall thing here is that they aren't doing good at setting up legacies. They aren't doing well at passing down values. You know, they do a great job during those days, and the whole nation does good because just like in the ancient Near East, however the king goes, so does the rest of the people. So if Hezekiah believes in Yahweh, the whole nation's going to believe in Yahweh. Because that's how they do it. But then the next king takes over, and you know, it's again this picture of this. There's no consistency. You know, there's no setting up, you know, of the covenant for them to read and for them to keep into their mind, and because that's one of the things that the king is supposed to do. The king is supposed to have a copy of the covenant. He's supposed to read it every day. He's supposed to keep it in front of him so he knows what to do, but it's clearly not something that they do. And I don't know if Josiah has that, if he has a copy of the covenant and he reads it all the time, or if during his reign, he was just so focused on, you know, like getting rid of all of this stuff and putting things in place that whenever his son took over, there was no pattern for his son to follow through.
Manasseh was Hezekiah's.
Yeah, I still think it's boils down to personal responsibility. Because David was a sinner and Saul was had the same opportunity as David.
Pour water much?
But they still made choices in their napkin. Yeah, they still made choices in their lives, which caused them a lot of problem. Yeah, and even if we can equate that today, we can focus so much on ministry and building legacies to our next generation, next to us. But I think they still have the choice to follow God or not.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like they.
We do see in the Bible that there aren't a whole lot of good father figures in the text. David, not a good father figure. Moses, not a good father figure.
Eli, Samuel.
I mean, yeah, like most of these guys, like you don't see good patterns for fatherhood in the Bible. And I think one of the reasons for that is God is the example of father. And I think that's one of the reasons why God is called God the Father, because we can see the example that he sets. But I don't think family fatherhood was focused on or highlighted that much. You know, in the ancient Near East and in those days, like the man's responsibility was to provide for the family. And being a good father, like I don't know how much that was highlighted in the culture. Yeah, because in the text you just you don't see it. Hezekiah was a great king, but you can see he didn't teach his son the way that he was supposed to, the way that, you know, how to rule. You can't assume that just because you set a good example, other people are going to follow that example. My friend Crystal, who teaches this week, she has this question that she asks everybody is, what is your legacy? What is the legacy that David left behind? What is the legacy that Solomon left behind? What are the legacies that these men left behind? And of course, what legacy are you leaving behind? What is the thing that you are passing on? It's one thing to live the right way. It's another thing to disciple, you know, and discipleship is so much more than what we look at today. You know, we look at discipleship as like an hour a week. I'm not coming down on the YWAM model of discipleship. I love that is like a core value, but you look at what a disciple actually was in the New Testament. Disciples were people who followed a rabbi around. Not everybody could be a disciple. You had to show a certain aptitude towards learning. You had to show that you could actually remember and teach the text with authority. And you would follow around a rabbi all the time, like you were with the rabbi all the time. If you were a disciple, you're following the rabbi literally everywhere. Like I'm not like exaggerating. Like I think maybe the only time you wouldn't follow a rabbi is when you went into the bathroom stall. Because being a disciple isn't about knowing what the rabbi knows. Being a disciple is about being who the rabbi is. That's what discipleship is. The disciples in the New Testament, they didn't just want to know what Jesus knew. They wanted to be like Jesus. And so the disciple would follow a rabbi everywhere, into the bathroom, not into the stall, but like, what if he blesses himself before he goes into the stall? What if he blesses himself when he comes out of the stall? You're not going to know that unless you follow him. You want to be everywhere that rabbi goes. The way we do discipleship now is not even curiosity. I think this is something that we see is missed. You see Moses is a good example. He discipled Joshua. And then he handed things over to Joshua, and Joshua did a really good job. Joshua didn't disciple anybody. And so I think that's one of the things that we see here is that these kings, they don't do a good job of discipling. They do an okay job. It's one thing to model behavior. That's one way of discipling. But to be somebody who is a discipler, you need to be hands-on. Amen. Let's take a pee break because I am. Good. All right. Interesting to note here is the echo of the downward spiral from Judges.
Hmm.
One of the things that we see in Judges is this picture of the downward spiral of Israel, where they started off good. You know, Deborah was one of the first judges where there was a lot of detail and nothing bad was said about Deborah. I think that's awesome. And then it slowly gets worse and worse. Gideon starts off good and he gets worse, and Jephthah worse, and then Samson is like the worst. You have this downward spiral thing happening in Judges, and this is kind of an echo of the downward spiral from Judges in Kings, where it starts off with Solomon and it slowly gets worse and worse and worse. And we see the promised curses from Deuteronomy 28. All of the things that are described in Deuteronomy 28 are going to be happening to the nation to God's people.
Let's go. I love the office.
Do you guys know The Office?
Who doesn't?
You know, when I'm in Europe, I have meals studying Office. And people are like, what's that? Oh, no, The Office, and it always breaks my heart when people don't know The Office. But
Like,
watch this.
when they don't know the series, or they don't watch.
Can you confirm that the straps are tight? Yes. And now the chains.
A lot of people think that Magic Camp is just for kids, and that's why so many other people in my class were kids. Self-fulfilling prophecy, it's really for anybody with a dream or with a belief in magic and a little extra time after school.
And now, Michael the Magic will attempt to escape from extreme bondage.
Can he do it? I don't see how he can.
I know how.
Dislocate his shoulders with his arm
No. No, everyone, now count down with me. 3.
Sorry. So is it true that if you can't get out and you don't want anyone to help you?
I will get out. Oh, yes, I will.
So we shouldn't help you, no matter how much you might make.
No, all right, just get a consequence.
Do this, okay?
Okay.
Yes. I cannot tell you how I plan to escape, other than by using magic. That is the magician's code. Separately, on an unrelated note, if you happen to find a small brass key.
Whoops. Don't do it
Can
again.
you confirm that?
All right, so the small brass key. The key to understanding the books of Kings is whether or not a king was loyal to the covenant. Maybe not. But that is the key to the book, or the small brass key, is whether or not a king is loyal to the covenant. That is going to be the major thing that we see moving forward, and that the author is going to use to describe as to whether or not the king was good or bad. This is played out in Deuteronomic terms. The king's attitude about the central place of worship, which was
Jerusalem.
the temple, which was where? Solomon builds the temple in Jerusalem, and this is going to be the central place of worship. And so in Deuteronomic terms, it's looking at, there being a central place of worship, and whether or not they advocated for syncretism. Do you guys know what syncretism is? Have you guys heard that before? Somebody can describe it for me.
Make religion fit into your own culture.
Yeah, it's basically the blending of religion, syncretism. It's like worshiping Yahweh the same way that you would worship Baal. Or like Asherah. Ashtoreth is the goddess of sex and war. And how you would worship Ashtoreth is having sex with a temple prostitute. And eventually Israel and Judah both have temple prostitutes. And so it's worshiping Yahweh by going and having sex with a temple prostitute. Syncretism. It's blending religions, worshiping Yahweh. It's doing some horrible practice and saying, oh, I'm going to go worship Yahweh by having sex with the temple. Okay, because whether or not they advocated for syncretism or if they promoted rival gods altogether, particularly Baal worship.
What do you mean by King's attitude about the central place of worship, like whether they honor the temple?
Yes, whether or not, and we'll see that with when we get to the kingdom split. How that is a major thing for the kingdoms of the north.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that, but their attitude towards whether or not they worship at Jerusalem or whether or not they advocate for people to worship other places. But particularly during this time, Baal worship is something that we're going to see a lot. We have that whole story with Elijah and the prophets of Baal or Baal or Baal, however you want to say his name. This is going to be something that is particularly highlighted. It's set up by the Solomon story, who has his reign summed up in two matters. Two things are important in the summation of Solomon's rule. The construction of the temple, which is filled with God's glory. When he constructs the temple and you have that first thing, he does this opening prayer, and you have the presence of the Lord come down and fill the temple, which is a really unique, important moment for the nation. It uses language similar to that in Exodus, where the Spirit of God filled the tabernacle for the first time. Then the other matter is his judgment for going the way of all kings. Deuteronomy 17:16-17 is a particular rule against kings accruing a lot of wealth and a lot of horses. And then in 1 Samuel 8, again, it talks about accruing wealth. So his reign is summed up in those two things. Constructing the temple, and then his heart was turned away. Promoting idolatry by way of his many foreign wives. He set up altars for all of them, eventually started worshiping there himself. And that was one that he promotes rival gods. Oops. You guys all right? It's also played out structurally through a common Reynolds formula. That's a weird word, but I spelled it correctly.
Is it?
Yeah.
Really? I understand like Ragnar or something.
Yeah. Regnal, or however you say it, but that's how you spell it. I check it 3 or 4 times from the book that I copied it from. I'll show you. And so the pattern of their regnal structure is this is how it's structured. You'll have each king, and the kings of Israel say, in whatever year
that they reigned. They were the king of Judah, and so also this guy was the king of Judah, this guy is the king of Israel, began to reign. And then it has how long they reigned and the location of their capital, their theological evaluation as to whether or not they followed in the footsteps of sin or followed in the footsteps of David. The sources, as in like, are they not, are you can find their events in, are they not written in the annals of kings of whatever? And then the death and who succeeded them. So that is the regnal formula. It's this guy came into rule in this year, while this guy was the king of here, and he began to reign here. In Judah, it mentions the name of the queen mother, how old he was when he became king, how long he reigned, and then the queen mother. I think the queen mother is highlighted here because there are a couple of them that are bad news bears. And so we have some where it says, like one of the kings, it says that the queen mother was removed from her position because she had an Asherah or an Asherah pole, and he had to remove that. Sources, and then again, death and succession. So this is one of the structural patterns that we'll see. So some of the kings have very little mention about them. It'll just say they reigned here, reigned this long, and this guy took over. So that's the stereotypical pattern. Or the regnal, or however you say it, pattern. Make sense? Yes. Kind of, sort of.
Yes.
The queen mother, does it also have something to do with, I know that like Jews, the religion gets passed on to the mother, not to the dad.
Possible, I don't know. In this case, I think it has to do because there are a few queen mothers that are important, but that could be a possibility. You found her? I don't say it. Is she really there?
Let's see.
Hello?
I don't know, she's like.
Oh, she's there. Okay, so the important pieces to the formula for this regnal or regnal formula is their theological evaluation. This is one of the things that's really important. No matter how long they ruled or their accomplishments, it came down to one thing. In the north, it was if they followed in the sins of Jeroboam. Spoiler alert, they all do. In the south, it came down to if they followed Yahweh and if they tore down the high places. I think in Chronicles, it starts to say whether or not they followed in the footsteps of their father David. David is one of the highlighted pieces in Chronicles. There's only a few kings that have a lot of stuff written about them. There are a lot of kings, some of them just have the barest minimum written about them. Despite the length of some of their reigns. In fact, there's this guy named Omri, who is a really important pivotal king in the north, but he gets like 1 or 2 verses written about him. But he is a really significant ruler. But God doesn't care about what he did as a king. He cares about whether or not he followed him, and he didn't. So he doesn't get a whole lot. Some of these kings will say that they'll rule for multiple years, but there's only a little bit written about them. Because it's all about loyalty to Yahweh. Doesn't matter how long you rule, doesn't matter the accomplishments, if you had civil war or whatever, doesn't matter. It's all about whether or not you were loyal to Yahweh. Yeah.
But when you're not loyal to Yahweh, they also display like in a very.
Yeah, now there are a few kings where it'll go into more detail as to what they did. Because Ahab has by far the most written about him from the kings of the north because of just how bad he was. You know, his marriage to Jezebel, the Baal worship, the killing of the guy for the vineyard and all this stuff. Because you know it's this huge, and how much this also serves to introduce Elijah and the ministry of Elijah. So you have a lot written about Ahab.
Yeah. So why do other kings get like a little, because if they did a lot wrong, you can also just write down what they did wrong.
Well, they sum it up. They say they followed in the sins of Jeroboam.
Okay.
Yeah, or it says that, the king followed and did not follow the way of his king, of his father David, or he kept in the sin of Rehoboam, his father. But it will say that, there will be a summation, and it's usually whether or not they continued in the sin, or whether or not they had something good about them, but north, is that all bad all the time? Now, the role of prophets. This is where we get two of the major prophets in the Bible, Elijah and Elisha. You have a lot that is written about these two. You can't really take one without the other. It's good to kind of use their ministries as like one long, unified ministry. They're both different. And one guy asks for a double portion. And if you actually count up how many miracles Elijah did versus how many miracles Elisha does, there are actually double. But you need to look at their roles as a whole. They become God's chosen agents in this holy war. You guys talked about holy war? Kind of a little bit. All war in the Old Testament, in the ancient Near East, all war was religious. We talked about that? We repeat it. All war is religious. And in fact, they viewed it as the gods were fighting each other. Okay? And so, for the conquest of Canaan, it was a view of Yahweh is fighting this God of this nation. And whenever Israel would have victory, it was viewed as Yahweh was better than that God. And this is all war, not just Israelites, even foreigners. Okay, so Assyria, their chief god is called Asher, and he is the god of war. And so when they defeat people, their view is our God has defeated your God, and the armies are just the tools that the gods are using to fight each other. Elijah and Elisha become God's chosen agents within this holy war. They are called to bring the message to the king and the main message of the early prophets is turn back to the covenant or exile is coming. That is the thing, it's turn back to the covenant. You are moving far away from the Lord, turn back to the covenant. Elijah and Elisha are against the northern kings and pagan Baal worshiper Jezebel. Right, Jezebel, her name becomes synonymous with evil later on in the text. It will say the spirit of Jezebel. Being mentioned as the queen of evil in Revelation. That Jezebel. Through these prophets, God demonstrates that he is still in control. I think it's interesting that I saw in my prep for this week, Baal, however you want to say his name, he is the god of lightning and storm. And so when Elijah calls that there's going to be a famine in the land for 3 years, that's a direct assault on Baal, who is supposed to be god of storms. And even in the conflict with the prophets of Baal, Baal is supposed to be the god of lightning, but he should have been able to have lightning come down and consume the sacrifice. But who is the God who actually has the sacrifice? Fire from heaven sometimes can be translated into lightning. So who is the real God?
Yahweh.
So through these prophets, God demonstrates he is still in control. In control over creation, over nature, over the nations, over Israel. The Deuteronomic cycle ends in the exile and dispersion of the northern kingdom. Okay. I'm comfortable with allowing you guys time to catch up. I used to, whenever I first started teaching, people were taking notes. I used to do this, I used to go. And I realized that I was causing anxiety. I didn't realize, I thought I was just being goofy and like, just kind of being an idiot. But like, as I was doing that, people would start, it's like, if you write notes and you try to write fast, all your muscles tense up and you're like, and you end up not being able to write fast. And I had a student actually tell me that that was causing anxiety. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Like, I didn't even realize I was doing this. I don't do that.
I have a quick question about the last statement. So with the Deuteronomy cycle ending, do you mean that the lesson plan verses were imposed because
Yeah.
they found fulfillment in exile?
Yeah.
So then when the remnant comes back after exile to Babylon, we see that they are struggling in Judah and they're trying to rebuild a community and things like that. So then the hardship they're facing then, would you see that more just as a consequence of everything that has happened? Or would you still see it as, oh no, it's still probably a purpose to get their attention so they would be obedient to the covenant still?
Well, let me start by saying, I don't know a direct answer to that, but I think I would say yes and no, because in the Old Testament, it's all about following and fulfilling that old covenant.
Yeah.
And how much are you holding to what God has given you following the law? And so when they come back from exile and they're continuing to rebuild, we see this swing of the pendulum. You know, pendulum swings like this, you know? You have these extremes where they got so far away from the covenant that exile was the punishment. And now coming back, getting settled in the land, you're gonna see the pendulum start to swing the other way. Where they're like, we were exiled because we didn't follow the covenant. Well, now we're gonna try to follow the law so hard that exile won't ever be a possibility. And so that's when they start building extra laws and stuff like that, because if we're not gonna break the Sabbath, then I'm not even gonna come anywhere close to anything that even looks like breaking this. So it is kind of the same thing. It's again, how much are they going to be able to hold to the law until Jesus comes and shows them a better way? Hope that it made sense.
Yeah. My understanding of covenant, can a covenant be fulfilled? So
Yes.
when they come back from exile, are they still under the covenant? Or is like
The Mosaic covenant?
the Deuteronomy?
Yeah.
Covenant?
Yeah, they are still under that covenant until Jesus.
So it could just happen all over again.
Good, yeah.
The same thing. Okay. It's not like this happened once and no, they're not God's people anymore, like the covenant is ended.
Yeah.
It's not like.
No, it's not. Yeah, they're still living under the old covenant when they come back from exile. They just now, they don't have the Ark of the Covenant anymore. It's gone. When Babylon destroys Jerusalem, the Ark is lost forever. We've never found it. It's been gone. Unless you watch
Indiana Jones.
Raiders of the Lost Ark. You know that it's in a warehouse in Germany somewhere. But that's a significant moment, it's the loss of the presence of the Lord. And the book of Ezekiel kind of goes into that, it's this gradual leaving, the presence of God gradually leaves the temple. And then when they come back, they build a second temple, but the presence never fills it. Because they don't have the ark, the presence of God is gone. They don't get it again until Jesus. History, am I right? I love Bible history. It's good. I like talking about the Bible and answering questions. You have any other random floaters that you still have questions on? Floaters.
I have a random one about the horses.
Okay,
That was really new to me.
okay,
I had never heard that Israel actually was told not to have horses.
Yeah.
But it did occur to me when Absalom was dangling there, that his mule run off, and I felt like, how unkingly to be there on a mule even, you know? And then, yeah, I looked up a little bit, and then of course, I remember like in the Psalms, you know, some trust in chariots and some in horses, you
Yeah.
trust in the Lord. But I've never seen that they were told not to have horses.
it's, I don't know if it's necessarily not to have horses, just to
Not
have
too
all,
much.
but to have, many horses, especially horses from Egypt. The thing that's significant about horses is that if you have a lot of horses, it means that you can have a strong army. And it's about attempting to build up your numbers and having a large chariot corps, which I don't think God didn't necessarily want them to not have a strong army. He didn't want them to trust in the strength of the army. And you guys remember at the end of 2 Samuel, David takes a census, and it's a bad thing to do.
Yeah.
The only reason why you take a census is to get money and to assess your military strength. And that's why it was a bad thing, is God didn't want him to do that.
By the way, it's in Deuteronomy 17, verse 15.
Yeah.
Question about the census. I think we had that in small group last week. Because we are wondering, like the Lord tells David to do the census, and then
Later on, it's
Yeah.
Satan. Oh,
Yeah.
my bad.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert. In Chronicles. So we talked a little bit about this the first day that I got here. I sat with Tamar and Kayla. And she asked a question, and one of the things that I used as an example to answer her question was this thing with the census. And one of the things we need to understand and to recognize about the Bible is you have this idea called progressive revelation. Where God is slowly revealing his plan. God didn't reveal that it was Jesus in Genesis 3:15 because we were ready for it. Why didn't God just send Jesus right away? Like, we needed Jesus, why didn't he just send Jesus? Because the world hadn't developed, there weren't a lot of people, there weren't a lot of languages being spoken. Jesus came at that one time, it would have been really difficult for him to minister to people, and then for people to carry on his ministry. Jesus came at a perfect time in history, because the Roman Empire had set up peace throughout the land. You could actually travel peacefully. They had roads so people could travel more easily, and everybody spoke one language. And so when Jesus came into this ministry, then afterwards people could then go and spread on, as a side note. But the author of Samuel, this is happening before exile and before the development of their understanding of the Lord. And also before language is fully developed. So back then, they didn't really have a good idea of the evils of the spirit world and that there is an evil Satan and people who hate you and want to destroy you. But they knew that God was sovereign, and so they attributed everything to the Lord, especially if it was something that they didn't understand. So when David takes a census and it's a bad thing, they don't have any understanding outside of that the Lord is in control of everything. So the author just writes what he understands. He's like, well, God made him take a census because everything is attributed to God. When you read the same account in Chronicles, it says Satan was the one who led David to do this sin and take a census, because by then they've experienced the horrors of Assyria, of Babylon, of going into exile. Language has progressed at that point, and now they have a much better understanding and idea of the spirit world and that there is an enemy. And so now they look back at the history and go, oh, it wasn't God that made David do this sin. It was actually Satan that caused him to do this. So that's why you have these two seemingly contradictory stories. It's because of the progressive understanding of what's going on in the world. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
But also leaves the question, like, especially in the much older stories, how can we really trust? And it's all the Lord says, and then it's like, okay, you know.
Well, that thought brings back to what type of literature are you reading in the Bible? Because if you're reading historical narrative, that is just somebody telling a story of what happened. That's just giving you insight of what God was doing. And just because I say the Lord told me something, that doesn't mean that the Lord actually told me something. But if you are writing an account of what happened in this class, and you're just telling people a story, you'll say, Daniel said, the Lord said for us to go do that. And then you look at the evidence, and you see, well, God didn't really want that. That's just them saying that God wanted that. So it's really good that we understand what we're reading as far as literature, who the author is, and who the intended audience is. Historical narrative is not looking to teach you a lesson. It's not looking to give you a deeper spiritual meaning. It's just looking to tell you what's happening. Is that?
Yeah, makes sense.
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah.
But here's the thing, the whole Bible was written by humans.
Yes.
Like, we all wrote it down, and sometimes it's like, for example, or probably Moses writing down like what he actually experienced, like face to face with God and what God directly told him. If there's like not that much, like it doesn't get passed on like a lot, and then it's written down. But for other things, for example, we have a lot of letters from Paul in the New Testament, and he wrote all of them to like the churches. How can we take that as like a guideline for us, or something like, oh yeah, we believe in that, and like we found stuff on that, when it's actually Paul writing it? And yes, he had a close relationship to God, and like a lot of things are also like, for example, still founded by other things that happen in history by the Bible, but there's certain things, it's just him. How do we know like what we can take from him, for example? Not just him, from Paul, for example, or like in general, just from what people are writing down. How much can we actually just take as, okay, it happened that way, and how much can we take from, okay, we should apply this in our own life?
Okay. So, great question. I don't know if I'm gonna have enough time to really cover it, but I'll do my best. Oh, here's a free lesson. Anybody want to be a teacher or a Bible teacher or doing things in front of people like this? Teachers, Bible teachers? This is not like a commitment. I'm not gonna go. This is just me asking where you're at. If you're ever in front of people and you go to erase a whiteboard, always erase up and down, because side to side will make your butt shake. Or if you do the jello one, because you just want to be aware of it. Okay, now I forgot where I was going.
Paul's letters.
Yeah, Paul's letters and the Bible. I forgot why I was about erasing it and putting stuff in. Oh, I got it, found it. So that's why I say understanding literary types is really important. Now, in Timothy, we see that he writes that all scripture is God-breathed and useful for teaching, blah, 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 blah. But there are some parts of the Bible, like if we take the approach that the Bible is God-breathed and it's the word of God, and I believe everything, blah, 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 we take that, then why aren't you sacrificing your children in fire? Because Manasseh does that, and that's in the Bible. Or better yet, in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus asked the apostles or the disciples, who do you say that I am? And Peter gets it right. He says, you're the Christ, the Messiah. And Jesus says, don't tell anybody. Have you ever told somebody that Jesus was the Christ? You've gone against what Jesus said. And why, as a Christian, when's the last time you handled a snake? When's the last time you picked up a scorpion? Where's your water bottle filled with poison? Because the gospel says that, you know, you'll handle snakes and you'll drink poison and everything will be fine. The thing is that some of the Bible is what we call didactic or prescriptive. Some of the Bible is prescriptive. Some of the Bible is do what it's saying. When Jesus says, love your Lord your God as all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor self, that is prescriptive. Do that. That's what we're supposed to do. Whenever you read things that says, you know, they boiled their baby because they were under, you know, siege, and they like Hezekiah. Like, we both agreed that we would eat our children, and I boiled mine, and now she won't boil hers. That's in there. Is that prescriptive? No. That's what we call descriptive. That's why I say it's good to understand literary types, because when you have narrative is descriptive. Not everything in narrative we should do. It's them telling stories. When you get into law is a type of literature. That's something to do. That is a prescribed thing. When you're going through the Ten Commandments, that is a prescription of what you should do. Okay? When you get into the New Testament, you start to get to epistles. Sometimes it's a little difficult to find out, are they just giving a prescribed thing for the times? Or is it something that I should do all the time? Because then you get into the thing of are you in any leadership role in the church? You're going against what Paul said. Paul said, I don't allow a woman to have authority over a man. Okay, so if you go to a church and a woman is leading worship, you're going against the Bible. So what we need to do is understand that Paul is writing to an audience that is experiencing a real situation. And with Paul's writings, it's a little bit more difficult to determine, are these what we call situational truths? Or are these timeless truths? And how do we know? It's hard to determine. Especially when it comes, now Paul is a different, I know that it's after time, I'm sorry. Paul is a more difficult thing to determine because I can have one belief and I can use Paul's writings to prove my belief. And you can have an opposite belief, you can use Paul's writings to prove your belief. So here's a question that I've been asked and I've thought, did Paul know that he was writing Holy Scripture? Did Paul know that he was writing things that were going to be used for centuries and centuries afterwards? I'll tell you, are we recording now? I'll tell you my thought. I don't think Paul knew that he was writing Holy Scripture to be used forever and ever, amen. However, he is writing guidelines for people how to act within churches that he helped to establish. And so there are truths that we need to apply. However, we need to consider context. And a big thing that feeds context is culture. We need to understand that. When he says women should be silent in church, I don't think that's a timeless truth. I think that is a contextual, situational truth for that particular church in that particular area. Because how they sat people was women sat on one side, men sat on the other side. Women were not educated, men were educated, and women were starting to get empowered in this area, and they had these examples of these like foreign prostitutes who were getting saved and coming in, and they had a whole lot of prestige in the time. They were coming in, and they were setting bad examples for how a church service should look, and it was looking really chaotic, and women were going, hey, what's happening? Paul's like, be quiet in church. When you get home, ask your husband. That's not a timeless truth where women just be quiet in church and rely on a man to learn things. That's a situational truth. Because you're disrupting what's going on. Does that make sense? Does that help any?
Yeah, it
Okay,
does. Yeah. But still the part where I'm in general, the whole Bible is kind of in a way, a story that's written by humans.
Right.
And
so how we determine what parts of the Bible we should, how we know what is canon, is we look at, that's not what you're looking for.
no, it is.
Is we look at fulfilled prophecy, and we look at did they stand the test of time? Because there's a lot of writings from back then that we don't include in the canon of Scripture, and largely because the Jews don't consider that to be inspired. And in the New Testament, it's all about was it written by apostles or people who were eyewitnesses of Jesus's ministry, and people who were connected to that. Because there's a lot of people who wrote during that time to claim that they had it. But it was all reflected off of whether or not it was from an eyewitness, whether or not it was from people who were actually around Jesus. And I still don't know if that helps.
It helps.
Maybe we'll talk about this more later, because it's time to close that.